heard more than enough from me. It's my great pleasure to to thank Damian Terry, who we saw just a few weeks ago actually with our president, and who kindly offered his parliamentary home for this closing session of the seminar. Damian, I'll stop. Let me give the floor to you, and thank you very much indeed for making this possible. It's a great privilege to be here. Thank you.
Madam President, dear colleagues, Mr. Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, let me wish you a warm welcome in this hemicycle of the House of Representatives. This hall hosted yesterday the last plenary session closing the 54th legislature. As you all know, election will be organized on Sunday, 26th of May, this year in Belgium for the House of Representatives, the regional parliaments, and, like in the other member states of the European Union, also in UK, for the European Parliament. Our Senate convenes today for the last time. On behalf of both House and Senate, all participants of this 100th Rose-Roth seminar are welcome once again. It is a great honor for the Belgian Federal Parliament to have had the opportunity to participate in the organization of this seminar in Brussels, where NATO has its headquarters. Le nombre de séminaires Rose-Roth organisés à ce jour, 100 en un peu moins de 30 ans, montre l'importance de cette initiative qui a été prise en 1990 par M. Charlie Rose, ancien président de l'Assemblée parlementaire de l'OTAN et membre de la Chambre des représentants des États-Unis, ainsi que Bill Rose, sénateur. Et selon moi, cette initiative demeure essentielle tout autant que nécessaire. Le programme a évolué du soutien initial des pays de l'Europe centrale et de l'Est après la chute du mur de Berlin dans leur cheminement vers une forme d'État véritablement démocratique. Un élargissement du public cible qui comprend maintenant aussi un grand nombre de parlementaires de pays non membres de l'OTAN, et c'est important de le signaler. Depuis 1990, le nombre de pays membres a d'ailleurs aussi augmenté de manière significative, une donnée politique qui a tout son intérêt. De même que l'Assemblée parlementaire de l'OTAN joue un rôle indispensable en permettant de faire entendre et de porter la voix des parlementaires des pays membres au sujet des matières liées à l'OTAN, ces séminaires, comme celui d'aujourd'hui, revêtent une importance fondamentale dès lors qu'ils permettent de renforcer le rôle des parlements et d'établir ou d'approfondir des contacts entre les pays membres. En démocratie, le contrôle démocratique de la défense et des forces armées, en particulier, obéit à des principes fondamentaux. Le poids de l'institution parlementaire en tant qu'institution de contrôle est encore renforcé grâce à l'organisation régulière de nos séminaires. Séminaires qui peuvent être consacrés à des questions d'actualité ainsi qu'à des formations destinées aux parlementaires, à leurs collaborateurs et aux fonctionnaires des parlements. À cet égard, je souhaite indiquer, à titre d'exemple, qu'à la Chambre, la Chambre des représentants dont je fais partie, pas moins de 4 commissions examinent les matières concernant la défense et le contrôle des forces armées en Belgique. La commission défense nationale, dont je suis le vice-président, la commission achats et ventes militaires, exactement celle qui a son importance dans le cadre, entre autres, de notre respect dans le cadre des investissements vis-à-vis de l'OTAN, la commission du suivi des missions à l'étranger, ainsi que la commission des relations extérieures. Commission qui examine, par exemple, la question de l'adhésion de nouveaux pays à l'OTAN. Concernant cette commission, je vous signale d'ailleurs qu'elle a adopté avant-hier, le 24 avril, le projet de loi portant assentiment au protocole du traité de l'Atlantique Nord sur l'accession de la République de Macédoine du Nord, signé à Bruxelles le 6 février 2019 et, vous l'avez en primeur, ce projet de loi a également été adopté hier, ici même, en séance plénière de la Chambre. Je vous signale en outre à ce propos que, sous la législature à venir, cette Assemblée examinera très probablement la proposition visant à toujours soumettre la participation des militaires belges aux missions internationales à l'approbation préalable du Parlement. The different items of the program of this 100th Rose-Roth seminar prove the relevance of the broadening of NATO on the political level. It seems to me that this theme is also closely looked upon in other places than in the sole member states or candidates member states. Anyway, today we live in an uncertain world due to the numerous and profound transformations in many areas. We look upon a more fragmented world, and a multipolar world is also developing not only on the states level, but also with uncontrolled non-state actors. Selon la vision stratégique pour la défense du gouvernement belge, le cadre européen constitue la dimension la plus importante de la politique belge en matière de sécurité, qui s'inscrit dans un cadre multilatéral de l'OTAN et de l'Union européenne, mais aussi en complément de l'OSCE. Il peut être dit à juste titre que l'Europe est quelque part un îlot de paix dans un océan chaotique, certainement en ce qui concerne le Sud. Pour mon pays, l'OTAN est et demeure, fallait-il encore le rappeler, l'un des principaux piliers de la politique de sécurité et de défense. Après la Deuxième Guerre mondiale, la Belgique a contribué à établir une paix d'après-guerre fondée sur le multilatéralisme où l'OTAN joue un rôle fondamental. En effet, Bruxelles héberge, comme vous le savez, les bâtiments de l'OTAN et à Mons également accueille le SHAPE, qui est le grand quartier général des puissances alliées de l'Europe. Dans un passé récent, la Belgique a participé à de nombreuses missions à l'étranger dans le cadre d'un effort plus général visant à faire des crises et à des menaces internationales graves. Ces dernières années, la Belgique a également réalisé des investissements considérables pour maintenir ses capacités à niveau. Je pense que nous sommes aujourd'hui tous conscients de la priorité qu'il convient d'accorder à la problématique de la sécurité. Les événements récents, et sans vouloir spécialement rentrer dans les détails, montrent à nouveau, au travers d'attentats, qu'une extrême vigilance est de mise, mais aussi que l'Assemblée parlementaire de l'OTAN et ses séminaires Rose-Roth sont des forums absolument indispensables qui permettent aux parlementaires de se rencontrer pour tisser et renforcer une entente mutuelle en vue de relever les défis internationaux complexes qui se présentent dans le domaine de la sécurité. Ces thèmes seront par ailleurs abordés au cours de la matinée et ils constituent une parfaite illustration de ce que je viens de vous dire. Finally, I wish to thank all participants for their numerous presence in Brussels today. More particularly, I thank the International Secretariat. You will see, dear colleagues, that you have the chance to sit down in our hemicycle where I was yesterday, and you will see that the seats are a little bit uncomfortable. But we stayed today only 2 or 3 hours here sitting. Yesterday was a little bit longer, and sometimes we have to stay on the seat all the night. So you see what happened in our Belgian parliament. Anyway, thank you everybody for your presence here in Brussels. I thank you all. Merci beaucoup pour votre présence.
So, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, we need to manage the acoustics here. Strange sound?
It's strange.
That is definitely. The moment you said it, it increased. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, first of all, I'm Roland Freudenstein, Policy Director of the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies, which is the think tank of the European People's Party. But right in the European Union. This acoustics is absolutely fantastic. I think. So we'll just try to continue.
Oh, this is better.
Yeah? We're coming to NATO and Russia. How did we get to where we are now? And as you remember, yesterday, the issue of Russia miraculously popped up in basically every debate we had. So now we're going to the heart of the matter. And you know, I was preparing for this panel. I was tempted to strike a note of modesty, but then I thought better of it, because we have just about the best array of experts on this topic, NATO and Russia, that I could imagine. We have right next to me Robert Pszczel, who is a senior officer for Russia and Western Balkans in engagements and public diplomacy division at NATO. And his claim to fame, I think, is that he held out in Moscow as head of the NATO Information Office for way too long for his health. But that, I think, qualifies him excellently, besides, of course, his Polish background, for this topic here. Next to him, we've got James Scher, who is now Senior Fellow with the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute, the International Center for Defense and Security, ICDS, and had an eminent role, I may say, as a Kremlin watcher in the United Kingdom, one of the decades-long observers of Russia, and therefore also the ideal panelist for this topic. And last but not least, Konstantin von Eggert. I mean, that sounds like a German. He works for Deutsche Welle. But when you listen to his opinions, you'll see that he can only be, at most, a self-hating German, like I am, when it comes to the particular German-Russian angle. But no, Kostya von Eggert is Russian, He's based in Tallinn these days. So Vilnius, sorry. And he will give us, of course, the view from the Eastern Empire. All right. Yes. Just one word. Thanks to the organizers, I'm extremely privileged and honored to be in this hemicycle, and coming back to the name of my organization, the Wilfried Martens Center. Wilfried Martens would be proud of me now. Yes. So let's start with this question: how did we get to where we are now? But I think before that, actually, we should define where we actually are now. And Robert, I'm turning to you. How would you describe NATO's relations with Russia? And don't give me the glasses half full or glasses half empty story. That's so 1990s. So let's have something more innovative here in describing the situation between the West and Russia. The floor is yours.
We were told that it's better if you take microphone near your hand.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, that works fine. Thank you, Roland. Thank you for those interesting ways of introducing us and the issue. It's not working? Yeah?
Just hold it in your hand.
Hold it in my hand. Okay, I'll hold it in my hand.
Take it out.
First of all, let me say how delighted and honored I'm here to be here. It's my second time here. In the late 90s, I was working in the Polish embassy, and there was a debate in this parliament about the accession, etc. And the result was good. Thank you. Merci, dankjewel. So, Madam President, Secretary General, distinguished parliamentarians and colleagues. Well, where are we? We're definitely not where we were in 2010, which I guess was the pinnacle of the NATO-Russia relations. We had a summit with then President Medvedev in Lisbon, and the quote of the day was enshrined in the joint communique that we were striving towards strategic partnership. It sounds a bit surreal today, I think, because, of course, we are not, well, we as NATO have not changed. We have not changed since the beginning of our policy when the Russian Federation has become the successor to the Soviet Union. So, as the title of this booklet and a seminar suggests, dialogue, transparency, and partnership will always have been our aims. And they remain the case. However, what has changed, of course, is the Russian policy, and it's the Russian actions, because while NATO takes a lot of interest in what is being said, and a lot of things which are being said in Russia are not particularly helpful. One example from, I think, yesterday, quoted by the famous press agency, the TASS, one of the top Russian journalists described missile defense system, and again, missile defense system, which is based, as you know, on the purely kinetic technology and has no relationship whatsoever to our nuclear deterrent as a nuclear threat. In fact, it's a pretext to attack Russian Federation, and therefore the Russian Federation reserves the right, and it's actually taking various steps in order to neutralize it. Now, it's wrong on so many counts. But the problem is that it's not just words like this which are irresponsible and rather provocative and not based on facts, it's various deeds. So, without any pleasure, without any satisfaction, but the Allies felt, starting 2014, of course, after the illegal and illegitimate annexation of Crimea and the continued Russian actions in Donbass, that we could not continue, so no business as usual. Now, weren't you alluded to the fact, or tried to kind of put me on a spot by saying, don't use the analogy glass is half full. Well, as far as the cooperation between NATO and Russia, at the moment the glass is empty, and that is a conscious decision. But it's not empty when it comes to some channels of discussion. And they are important these days. And there is no, in our view, there is no contradiction. So, you know, the 3 Ds, as it's called, NATO is all about acronyms, defense, deterrence, and dialogue, is not only the best, because of course that is the view of all 29 member states. But it is, I think, the most appropriate and forward-looking policy that the alliance has both elaborated and is actually implementing towards the Russian Federation. Because, let's face it, the challenge is very serious. We are dealing with the actions that already mentioned concerning Ukraine and other countries like Georgia, so on. We're dealing with a whole array of hybrid actions. We're dealing with disinformation. But we're also dealing with, unfortunately, the Russian Federation, which has changed when it comes to, when you compare to where we were when we had cooperation, when we had partnership, in terms of its, if you like, vision of the outside world. You probably have noted, I hope, recent opinion polls which shown that there is over 70% of positive views on Mr. Stalin in the Russian Federation. Now, at the time where we started our partnership, that was about 25. That's a major difference, and it doesn't come by chance. The second statistics which I saw, I think this morning in the Russian press, says that over 50% of those polled in Russian Federation believe that essentially perestroika and all those reforms and changes were not worth it. This is stunning. So we're dealing with a very different policy of the Russian Federation in the military, in the political dimension, but we're also dealing with a rather different society in terms of the way that it has been conditioned. Russia today, unfortunately, is quite a militarized place in terms of the public discourse. This is regrettable. This is not good. But NATO is determined to proceed with dialogue where it's possible at the level of the NATO-Russia Council. We are open to the military dialogue because we need it in order to minimize the risk of any confrontation. So I don't think I said anything original, but I don't think that was my task. But the point that I want to stress, and I want to give the microphone to other colleagues so we have a real debate discussion, is that we cannot, and that is why NATO is not doing this, we cannot base our policy towards Russia on the evaluation which is based on certain illusions. It has to be based on facts. It has to be based on the reality as we face it. And if there are people who feel a bit uncomfortable with it because they think that this is not very optimistic approach, well, I think the simple observation is that it's much better to have a policy which, A, commands the support of all the NATO countries, because that is our strongest commodity, our unity, our solidarity, while at the same time, the policy which reflects the reality. And the visions that we have of democratic Russia, the country which we could call our partner, is the vision that we want to keep. But we have to adapt our policy to the realities of the day as they are. I'll stop here.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert. That may not have been completely original, but it was a good description of the situation we have at hand in Russia. And certainly it was also a good overview of NATO's dilemmas. On the one hand, staying close to reality, the reality that we deal with, and at the same time preserving unity. Now, let me turn to James Sher. James, I remember yesterday Ian Brzezinski, in his very first statement in the plenary, talked about the imaginary situation that with a revanchist Russia, for example, if the Baltic states were now outside of NATO, what would happen? And immediately my Putin verstehing German soul kicked in and asked, but if NATO hadn't enlarged so aggressively, I'm putting it provocatively, if NATO hadn't enlarged so aggressively, maybe Putin wouldn't have become so revanchist. So, was it all our fault, James?
Thank you, Roland. I want to return you to the task you gave me yesterday, which was to explain how we got here. And the first thing I would say is, Being immersed in Russia for many years makes one a connoisseur of various shades of black. I also want, because I did not do so yesterday, to thank the organizers of the Rose-Roth seminar, who, despite my proclivity for irreverent dinner table anecdotes, has invited me, I think now on 6 occasions, to address this distinguished gathering. And I am also very impressed to find myself in such handsome and impressive surroundings for addressing so gloomy a subject. The entourage, the inner circle of Boris Yeltsin when the Cold War ended, presented the following view to us. We have abandoned Marxism-Leninism. We have abandoned the command economy and are introducing liberal market reforms. We have liquidated the Warsaw Pact. We have dissolved the Soviet Union. We have dismantled the entire system of military confrontation. In short, we have eliminated the difference between East and West, and we expect equivalent boldness from you. And what NATO understood quite early was, we expect in this most uncertain and unpredictable of times that NATO should abandon its autonomy, and the European Union to a large extent as well. And soon, very soon, we began to understand something else. That it was axiomatic in Russia, however liberal, democratic, pro-Western people were, that we should recognize that Russia naturally has a right of preeminence over its neighborhood and all its traditional zones of influence, and for the sake of European stability, we should welcome this. But by 1994, or thereabouts, we were understanding that the newly independent states of the former Soviet Union were countries and peoples with their own aspirations, their own view of their own history, and their strong determination no longer to be part of this zone, which Russia, I stress again, regarded as, and still does, as its entitlement. The enlargement of NATO against this background was seen almost across the board in Russia as an anti-Russian policy. And one could explain to Russian audiences with clarity and dispassion and patience that in the main this is not about you. NATO is enlarging because the countries of Central Europe remember the legacy of the gray zone between the wars, and they are determined that we not revive this, because we all know where this would lead. And even Germany, which was the principal European architect of the strategic partnership with Russia, understood better than anyone, knowing this history, that the countries of Central and Eastern Europe had to be firmly anchored in European institutions and Western security structures, or everything would unravel. But one could make these points in Russia, and with absolute futility, because we got nowhere. In the wake of our NATO's military intervention in Kosovo, and the US and its coalition intervention in the Iraq War, but particularly after the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, Russia's dominant view solidified, and the perception there was that democracy promotion, NATO enlargement, even EU enlargement, which was seen as another penetration into Russia's zone of influence of a very in-depth kind, military intervention and regime change all constituted a single, coherent Western threat. This was the essence of Western policy as Russia perceived it. Even before Viktor Yanukovych fled Kiev and fell from power in Ukraine in 2014, this threat assessment in Russia had to all intents and purposes become unchallengeable. I have been part of Track 2 dialogues. I believe very much in dialogue, but I have to assure you that we all can testify to this, that discussion and dialogue makes no difference on this point, particularly in an atmosphere where there is no trust. In 2014, I am a member of the celebrated Valdai Club, and I was present when some very clear warnings were sounded, and one was that it is time the West understood that it must either relearn the lessons of Yalta or risk war. The theme of the Valdai Club in 2014 was new rules or no rules. Many regarded this as a challenging question. It wasn't a question, it was an ultimatum. And I think what we've seen, and I think what many of you were discussing yesterday, is that Russia today observes no rules. And that sadly is where we are. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, James, for this another bleak assessment. Just one follow-up question. Coming back to the original question here, how did we get to where we are? Let me quote Toomas Ilves, former Estonian President Toomas Ilves, who somewhere around 2014 said, Georgia in 2008, Russia's war against Georgia in 2008, was the wake-up call, but we've been hitting the snooze button ever since. So in other words, James, did the West recognize the danger too late? And by the way, that's another argument that some of the Putin verstehers are actually using by saying we completely underestimated Russian sensitivities, fears, as irrational as they may be, and so on. How would you answer to this question of timing? Was the threat recognized? Could something have done to prevent the situation from deteriorating the way it did?
I think there was only a consensus to change, and this a realization in the West that we had to change the paradigm in looking at Russia. Only really arose in 2014. Before then, it was almost obligatory to regard Russia as a partner. First a strategic partner, then a difficult partner, then a very problematic partner, but always a partner. And this language was almost obligatory in official discourse, and behind it was hope. Behind it was a lot of feelings of guilt. I personally know a number of senior military officers who are very robust on the question of the military threat Russia poses, but who all privately say, well, after all, it was our fault. Ukraine is really theirs. We have no business there. We should not. No, they were not all Germans. A lot of them are British.
Thank you for saying that.
No, seriously. So there's a mixture of hopefulness, of guilt, of feeling Chamberlain-like. If at first you don't succeed, try again. And by 2014, it changed. And I would say in the UK, after the poisoning of Skripal, there was then yet another step change. May I just make one final point? So much of what perplexes us now and we find so difficult to deal with, which is Russia's involvement at so many levels in exploiting all the weaknesses of our own liberal democratic systems, election hacking and covert action and the rest of it, in many respects, this is counterintuitive thought, this change of emphasis by Russia is a sign of our success, because enough has been done since 2014 to raise Russia's risk calculus about further big military adventures. And that danger has receded to some extent. And so to some extent, these other things we are looking at is Russia's response to increased weakness. After all, these measures are comparatively cheap, they are inexpensive, there's not a lot of risk, and it's quite clear we do not have the tools and the understanding to be able to address them very well.
much. Robert, you wanted to come in with a short comment, and then we turn to you, Kostya.
Yeah, just to kind of, it wasn't posed to me, but in case there were any questions, NATO does not do psychoanalysis. We know the facts of the threats and the opportunities as well. But, you know, this question of potential legitimate sensitivities, I think that was taken care of in the Founding Act, and there were a number of decisions taken by allies which we have honored today. NATO decisions taken at 16 are honored by NATO at 29, but psychoanalysis we don't do.
Neither therapy, I gather. Konstantin, we're now moving to the nation that we've been talking about all the time, and so here's my provocative question to you. Is Putin scared now after this staunch response of NATO defense deterrence dialogue? Or does he think NATO is still a pushover and he can play with the West as he likes? And the other thing, the other important question I'd like you to answer. Now, is the problem Putin or is the problem the Russians?
Thank you very much. I would like to thank NATO Parliamentary Assembly for a second invitation to Rose-Roth seminar, and I congratulate you on the 100th one. It's a great honor to be the token Russian here, and it's a long time since being a broadcaster, it's a long time since I held this sort of, wired mic in my hand. Makes me feel so 1970s, like Baron Giscard d'Estaing announcing to the world that he had yet another series of fruitful discussions with Leonid Ilyich Brezhnev about détente. Speaking of which, I think that, answering to your question, the only thing Putin is scared about is losing power. And the whole policy of his is designed, first and foremost of all, to keep this power. And I think that, I think I mentioned that in Batumi last year, that all comparisons to Cold War are pretty legitimate, but we have to have in mind one specific thing. And that is, as opposed to the Leonid Ilyich and the Politburo of the old, the current Russian leadership not only rules Russia, it also owns it wholesale. And this creates a very, very big distinction in decision-making in the Kremlin. Come to think of it, the Soviet leadership was engaging in what he thought was the defense of Russian national interests, or rather Soviet national interests as they understood it, and promoting a certain brand of ideology across the globe. They never thought they're going to lose power, and they never thought that income from gas exports or oil exports will come directly into their pockets. And I think that this fear of losing power is also very much connected to fear of losing assets and eventually freedom. And that creates a very specific brand of politics in which, and we know it, so I'm not going to say anything particularly new here, this brand of politics is very much playing a set of very weak cards pretty recklessly and nonchalantly in order to scare the West, Western politicians like you, who are not used too much to such blatant risk-taking because you are responsible to your public. The current Russian leadership is not responsible to the Russian public. It was never elected, just like the Duma was never elected. It's 450 members of the Kremlin administration, a specific department of the Kremlin administration. So I think that although Putin is not scared, in a sense, I'm pretty sure he knows that Polish tanks are not going to roll into Smolensk anytime soon. But I think that he finds NATO as such a big challenge to his regime. Because once you, for example, and that started in the late 90s, once you say NATO is not an enemy anymore, it entails a lot of other things. It entails rearranging Russian alliances. It entails speaking about doing something about the Russian armed forces, about democratic control of the armed forces. In the end, because NATO is an alliance of democracies, to be in alliance with NATO means you have to do something about Russian democracy. And that is something that Putin doesn't want to do. And in my mind, he's been, and I'm finishing these initial remarks, and I think that what we've seen in the last few weeks, and especially in view of the Ukrainian election, is very important. First of all, we've seen about a couple of months ago a poll by Levada Center, pretty much the only big polling organization in Russia which can be relied on, stating that Russians took notice, finally, of their living standards, their actually disposable income, are falling 5th year in a row. They suddenly started being apprehensive about foreign wars, like Syria, like paying for Donbass, and even, crash boom bang, asking questions about how much did the Crimea bridge cost. That doesn't mean there's a revolution brewing in Russia, but Putin, not being a democratic ruler, still pays very, very close attention to public opinion. Because, of course, as any undemocratic ruler, he wants to be liked by the public. He wants to be a 500-euro note in the eyes of the Russians. And feeling that this is decreasing because of economic difficulties, because of apprehension about the raising of the pension age, because of growing prices, because the VAT was jacked up. I think that because of all that, the feelings of the Russian public start to wobble. And you know what the response is. It's not saying, well, by the way, let's let the steam out. Let's introduce more flexibility in our politics. Let's do a couple of honest elections. No way. The response was adopting yet another series of laws creating more strictures for people expressing themselves on the internet. Then, yesterday, a decision to start granting Russian citizenship to residents of the occupied areas of eastern Ukraine. And finally, something we didn't talk about yesterday, and that is the Vladivostok Summit with Mr. Kim, or Comrade Kim rather, which, judging by the rhetoric coming of the Kremlin, was designed to completely undermine President Trump's attempt to denuclearize North Korea. It is about security guarantees. It's about basically telling Mr. Kim, don't worry, demand more, Moscow is with you. My suspicion, judging by our previous experience, is that we're on the brink of Mr. Putin launching yet another stage in this Cold War II, designed to remobilize the garrison of Fortress Russia, which he's been creating for quite a few years, but especially after the Crimean annexation, and to force the West again to reconsider whether it wants to go to yet another round of confrontation. And probably, and this is the last thing I'm going to say, probably some of his calculations are based on reality, because if we read about, read the Bild Zeitung yesterday or the day before yesterday, with revelations of this correspondence between the German ambassador in Washington and members of Congress, that is hope, because the feeling in Moscow is that there is always a possibility to find those who will say, no, 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 we don't need this confrontation. So I think we're not on the brink of World War III, Don't worry about it. But I think that we are on the brink of another stage in the Kremlin regime defending its positions inside Russia by jacking up the pressure, by increasing the pressure externally.
Thank you so much. As you see, it's not getting more optimistic here on this panel. But I would like to take up Konstantin's last question and put it to Robert and James. So are we ready for another round of confrontation? Can NATO maintain unity if such an escalation happens? Or are the cracks in the West, the cracks even in NATO, possibly going to increase? And this is a question I would also like some of you to take up after we open it up to the audience. But here's the question to James and Robert.
First, whether we like it or not, we are in a confrontation. The word the Russians use most often to describe it, particularly in military circles, is protivoborstvo, which means antagonism or confrontation. This is seen by the Russians, I think correctly, as an objective fact, and we have difficulty regarding it as one. I can't allow myself to be completely pessimistic about Western unity because it has endured to this point, despite the fact that we have to renew, the EU has to renew sanctions every 6 months. Here we are 5 years later, and they are still being, the debate is whether they should be toughened, not removed. But where I firmly agree with Kostya is that the more Russians here, influential and prominent people, say, this is not to our advantage, this cannot go on, we must find a way of compromise, this strengthens those in Russia who believe that they are winning and will win if they remain strong and determined and continue doing what they're doing. And this is the real danger. We are not making things easier and better by speaking in this way. We are prolonging the problem.
Well, I mean, the short answer to your question, Roland, we ready? I mean, we have to be. I think obviously we are, you would not expect from a NATO official to say that we are not ready, obviously, but to explain why I can say with conviction that we are as ready as we can be in the circumstances, I would simply point out to a number of steps taken by the allies individually and of course collectively, because it's worth, I know there was a lot of about this issue said yesterday, but still it is unprecedented to have the enhanced forward presence, the presence of troops from almost all NATO countries in territory of the three countries, allies and Poland. The number of exercises, you hardly see a day without some important element of us practicing together, whether in the north, in the east, or in the south, the west. We have taken a number of steps to improve our command structures, to deal with the mobility issue. Our cooperation with the European Union is as intensive and as strategic as it ever been. And yes, let's be honest, thank you, Mr. Putin. The 2% goal, not achieved fully, but we are much closer to it. There is simply a number of extremely important actions taken by us, plus we have plans for the future, the readiness initiative, etc., and so on. But having said this, there is a big job which still needs to be done. I hope you all liked the speech of the Secretary General in the joint US Congress. We're very proud of him. I think it was a great speech. But there has to be a case made to the public in all NATO countries, and who better to do it than the parliamentarians. There is a political dimension to this. Yes, it is a challenge. It is a challenge, and like James said, It's not our choice. We are not in confrontation with Russia. We are not seeking a confrontation. We don't want to see Russia as an adversary. We would like to see Russia as a partner. But we cannot close our eyes to what is happening. So there is a need to explain politically. Yes, only NATO countries can make decisions about enlargement. Only NATO countries can decide what course of action they can take. And we should not apologize for helping our partners in distress, like Ukraine and Georgia, Moldova and others. This is not our just right, it's our duty. And this has to be communicated. It's a question of defense, of course, investment. It's a question of, yes, the public opinion. Let me just, this is, maybe because I spent Easter leave in Poland, so we like history. First of all, it's today, as it happens, is the Chernobyl anniversary, the biggest radiation leak in history. This is something which our colleagues in Moscow should remember. You need to be well tied in and integrated into the international community in order to prevent disasters like this. Secondly, in 1981, there is no anniversary of this, but you know the facts that because of the developments, because in my country, 10 million people in Solidarity members, wanted to take our own decisions about our own future. And that was a big problem. That was a big problem in Kremlin. But it wasn't just usual rhetoric, some of it actually very similar to the one we can hear today. There was an exercise scheduled for December 1981 called, surprise, surprise, Alliance Soyuz. Very funny. 81, which was actually a plan to start an invasion, right? Strongly spurred by a certain gentleman called Mr. Honecker. That invasion did not take place because there were various actions taken by international community led by President Reagan, who wrote letters to other leaders. The Pope wrote a direct letter to Mr. Brezhnev, the Pope. And this was all in 1981. Yes, we know history then, Poles, General Jaruzelski, martial law and all this, but make no mistake, there would have been a big war if the Russian intervention, Soviet intervention taken place. In other words, there are options, there are decisions that can be taken, there are actions that can be pursued. Let's not fall into the trap which I think Kostya described, which is what Mr. certain gentleman in the Kremlin would like us to be afraid. Let's not be afraid, because we have no reasons to be afraid, but at the same time, we have no reason to be complacent, because the problems will not go away. And we still should hope that we will at some point deal with Russia, which is a partner, that we can resolve the common problems.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Robert. I'd like now to turn to the audience. And remember, the key questions here are, how did we get here? Did the West make some mistakes? Maybe was the mistake that the West was too soft, or did enlargement happen too fast? Well, okay, that's a no-brainer. But exactly what things happened in the past from which we can draw lessons for the present and the future? And the other big key question, is the West ready for a next round of confrontation or escalation? Now, for questions, or comments from your side, please push the red button ahead of you and speak directly into your microphones. Hope they work better than these ones, but they should, because they're used every day. I have 5 people on my list, and we'll take those, well, let's take 3 or 4 of those, depending on the length. Andrius here is keeping track, and then we'll do another round anyway, and possibly several others. So we'll start with Richard Binion, head of the UK delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly.
Thank you.
Sir.
I hope this is working. In one sense, you could argue, very simplistically, that if Putin had behaved better, we might be having an existential crisis of the future of this alliance, because defense spending would have continued to deteriorate, to reduce, and the pressures within our budgets of our individual alliance members would have continued to be questioned by some of our colleagues. But I come from a part of England which, about 40 kilometers away, a chemical weapon, Novichok, was used, which could have killed 4,000 people. And I have entirely bought into the hawkish response to that, which was supported by so many countries across the alliance and beyond, and 154 Russian intelligence officers were expelled, and I hope that that strong reply plays into the narrative that what Russia really responds to is strength. But my question is one that might seem to say, have we got that right in the long term? Because as biology, at the very least, if not democracy or an overthrow of some sort, will mean that Putin will go at some point. And in the future, with a future regime, should we not be being hawkish doves or dove-like hawks in that we are talking to the next generation, and that perhaps we're using more cultural connections, perhaps we're using more official channels and political connections to other forces within perhaps the emerging ruling class in Russia? Is that a naive view, or should we continue to bash away when they behave badly, increase spending, more enhanced forward presences and other sorts of things? Or or do we need to be more nuanced?
Excellent question. Jean-Michel Boucheron, former member of the French delegation to the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. Sir.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Chacun sait que la Russie n'a aucune tradition démocratique. Chacun sait que M. Poutine est un roublard. Je ne sais pas comment les interprètes vont pouvoir interpréter ce mot, mais nous ne devons avoir aucune naïveté vis-à-vis de M. Poutine. Mais le Président, à l'instant, a demandé à ce qu'on recherche les fautes qui ont été commises dans cette affaire, et notamment les fautes occidentales. Il y en a au moins deux. La première, c'est au moment où les États-Unis d'Amérique ont voulu disposer à travers le monde d'un réseau de systèmes antimissiles basés sur les radars et les missiles. Il y a eu une propagande mauvaise. Moi, je ne suis pas du tout opposé à ce que les États-Unis disposent dans le monde d'un grand réseau de radars et de missiles antimissiles. Je suis partisan que l'Amérique ait des positionnements qui correspondent à son rôle mondial. Mais, là où je ne suis pas d'accord, c'est que pour installer ces missiles, les néoconservateurs américains ont utilisé vis-à-vis de la Russie et de l'Iran un discours hystérique. Hystérique. Et en Russie, moi j'ai été souvent dans ce pays en fonction de mes responsabilités en tant que président de la défense française, il y avait un état de sidération à cette époque. Donc, on pouvait installer ce système sans utiliser cette propagande un peu ridicule, et certains en sont restés là. Ils revivent la guerre froide comme une deuxième jeunesse. Bon, ça c'est la première erreur. La deuxième erreur, elle est européenne. Elle porte un nom, elle porte le nom de M. Barroso. Et il a voulu, en passant des accords économiques avec l'Ukraine, il a imaginé qu'une chose pareille pouvait se faire sans un dialogue tripartite avec la Russie. C'est, en matière stratégique, le niveau zéro. Il est évident que cette affaire ne pouvait pas se traiter à deux, mais devait se traiter à trois, et que c'était possible, qu'à l'époque les choses étaient ouvertes. Et à partir de ce moment-là, tout le reste s'est engrainé. M. Poutine ne rendra jamais la Crimée, tout le monde ici le sait, même si tout le monde ne le dit pas, mais tout le monde le sait. Bon, on le sait bien. Alors, la question est de savoir, Est-ce que nous restons en cette situation, bloqués? C'est ça la question. Est-ce que c'est l'intérêt des Européens et de la Russie, et des deux à la fois, de rester dans ce non-dialogue, ce blocage? Or, la peur de la Russie, je voudrais ici rassurer tout le monde, hein. Le budget des États-Unis, c'est 20 fois le budget de la France, militaire. Hein. Le budget militaire de la Russie, c'est 2 fois le budget de la France. Alors, je sais ce qu'on peut faire avec 1 fois le budget, j'imagine ce qu'on peut faire avec 2 fois le budget, croyez-moi, ça ne va pas très loin. Bon, surtout en termes d'invasion de l'Europe ou d'annexion de tel ou tel pays. Bon, rigoureusement impossible. Donc, restons raisonnables et regardons sur le long terme. Et le long terme, sur le plan stratégique, c'est quoi? Premièrement, est-ce que l'Europe et la Russie ont intérêt à coopérer avec les immenses espérances en termes de croissance que ça peut entraîner, quand on voit l'immensité du territoire russe? Et deuxième question stratégique, et là, je suis étonné un peu de la politique de M. Trump. Deuxième question stratégique, à l'heure où un formidable bras de fer entre l'Amérique et la Chine se prépare, est-ce que c'est supérieurement intelligent de renvoyer la Russie vers les Chinois? Est-ce que c'est une bonne idée? Moi, je vous pose la question, mes chers collègues, parce que nous avons la responsabilité de raisonner sur les 30 ans qui viennent. Est-ce que c'est une bonne idée de renvoyer la Russie vers les Chinois et un certain nombre d'autres pays, d'ailleurs, qui pourraient suivre dans le sillage russe? Voilà les grandes questions qui doivent se poser. Je ne dis pas que j'ai les réponses. Et à mon avis, c'est comme ça qu'on va poser le problème.
Je vois qu'on aura des discussions très intéressantes. Ce sont des questions excellentes. Voilà. I now have 11 more on the list. So I know that most of you are used to giving speeches or making substantial statements. I understand this, but please consider that we have just slightly over 30 minutes left, so keep that in mind. Next on the list is Sir Nicholas Soames, member of the UK delegation.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I have 2 parts to my question. First of all, I'm very grateful to the panel for a really fascinating and interesting assessment. On the military side of NATO, the truth is that in every NATO talking shop, of which this is one, we all congratulate ourselves about how well we're doing, but actually the NATO pace of transformation has been positively glacial. We still cannot move large amounts of troops and equipment across Europe in an easy manner, and there remains a very great deal to be done on that. But on the broader question, I think that NATO is missing a very big chance in dealing with Russia with its diplomatic power. NATO's diplomatic heft has been largely ignored. I personally believe that despite Russia's astonishingly bad behavior in the Ukraine, in the Crimea, in Salisbury and in England, it is essential that the NATO-Russia Council is re-established as a matter of urgency, not to allow the Russians to get away with anything, but to ensure that they are properly held to account and that they understand that were they to stick to the rules and were they to play by the rules and were there to be a proper forum for these conversations, it would very greatly go some way to diminishing the extraordinary misunderstandings that currently pervade. I mean, we seem to have lost the argument altogether that NATO is a defensive alliance, the most successful defensive alliance the world has ever known. We seem to forget its great triumphs, we've lost our confidence, and we don't have a coherent plan in any way for dealing with Russia. I'd like the panel's views on that.
Thank you very much. We take one more question and then we'll have a first round of answers. Ojar Skalnic from Latvia.
I'm just going to continue with Mr. Boucheron's question at the end, and it's about this trio, the US, Russia, and China. Who is manipulating who is in the best position to exploit this? And does the European Union, which aspires to strategic autonomy, have a role in this at all between these 3 powers? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, let's turn to answers. Kostya, why don't you start?
I'm not going probably to reply to all questions because I don't think that I'm competent to, I'm competent to speak about certain things. For example, deployment of ballistic missile defense, whether it was a matter of propaganda or not. I would like to turn first to the honourable member of British Parliament, asking about toughness. Well, actually, I'll say something that may sound a bit paradoxical. The tougher you are, the better it is for the future of Russia. Because with the current political regime, any attempt to be nuanced will be seen as weakness. That's the way these people think. In many ways, they do not think as the Brezhnevs and Gorbachevs and Yeltsins of the old. They think in a very, very specific terms. If you become nuanced, then you have some weakness. And the idea is then how to discover what kind of weakness you have and how to exploit it. So I think that although, and here I can link to what Sir Nicholas said, reopening the NATO-Russia Council may seem like a good idea, but the issue is what kind of dialogue do you expect? I mean, there's this idea that Putin misunderstands something, and if only we explain it to him, he'll suddenly say, hey, God, I mean, I didn't get it. We need to change the policy straight away. First of all, people who will come to this council will be people repeating the lines that are being given to them. They do not have the autonomy of a Gromyko, of a Binion, to deal with issues on the spot. And I think that this is a big problem. You are dealing with an extremely cowardly and increasingly deprofessionalizing class of civil servants who are afraid for their assets and for their positions, for not being seen as loyal enough. And this is a huge problem in dealing with Russia. So, yes, maybe dialogue is good, but what you're going to discuss? You're going to say, well, get away from Ukraine, get out of there. And so, no, we're not going to do that. The only thing that you'll continue to go back to is what can be very, very theoretically described as kind of new Yalta II arrangement, which is not going to happen for reasons we all know. So in a sense, if you want to spend some time in a cul-de-sac, then that's fine. I mean, you can probably discover some interesting bits and pieces and details, but it will still be a dead end. On issues of Russia and China, Monsieur le Boucheron, I don't think that Russia or Putin's Russia is in any way in a position to be given away or taken away from China. Putin has his view of China, and I think it's becoming a bit more apprehensive in the last few years because I don't think he got what he wanted after 2014 from this relationship with Beijing. What he sees a growing military power in the East, which increasingly doesn't want to ask Russia about certain things, like what it's doing in Central Asia. So I do think that saying that for some reason you have to accommodate the Kremlin, because then it will go and rush into Chinese arms. Well, I think that's a bit simplifying the issue. Putin has his own view of China, as I said, and I think that he will be very, very, very keen to play this game if anyone offers to play this game. Oh, you know, I'll go to China in case you push me too hard. But you have to make him play this game. And he'd like to play it, by the way, I'm pretty sure. So I'm not certain there is this issue. I can tell you what happened in October when John Bolton came to Moscow and told Putin about the new policies with regard to China, with regard to Iran, and with regard to abrogating the INF Treaty. It was a shock, and I think that the Kremlin started to feel extremely uneasy, exactly because, that's the last phrase I'm going to say, exactly because Bolton did not offer to negotiate what you're going to do for us in case we do things on China. And I think that's the way to keep it.
Thank you.
James.
Let me confine myself to 3 questions and 3 points. First, our first British colleague reminded me of something that I would have said earlier and which others on this panel might not agree with, that Putin is not the fundamental problem. The fundamental problem, which is why I emphasize the differences in the Yeltsin era, is that on many issues of profound importance, such as influence on rights in Europe and systems of European security, there are very different outlooks and there are some very different interests. If we make the heroic assumption that Putin and his entire, the entities surrounding him, which we call the regime, are replaced by people much more in the mold of the 1990s and not more radical, we are still going to find Russia very difficult to deal with. There should be no illusions about this. So let us not over-personify this issue. Secondly, I agree with and admire Monsieur Boucheron's emphasis on wider perspective and the long term. But I think we must accept that the fundamental issue is the following: that Russia now explicitly has repudiated and torn up the legal and treaty regime that brought the Cold War to an end. Russia regards itself as a principled opponent of the Helsinki-based international order. They do not disguise this. I can quote you chapter and verse, and there is absolutely an inner logic to what they perceive and how they have responded to it. Also, I find it incongruous to suggest, whatever view we take about US and for that matter British policy during the Iraq War and some other things, even where international law has possibly been violated by the United States, that therefore it is somehow appropriate for us to say to Ukrainians, because of all of this, you now no longer have a right to be a fully sovereign power in command of your own choices and in possession of your own territory. This would be a perverse incongruity. My last point, simply, and it fits in with the others, I accept the realism of what Sir Nicholas has said, but don't forget, you probably saw what one of Russia's most experienced deputy foreign ministers said in the Financial Times when he was asked the kind of question we hear about whether Russia ever considers the effect all this has on its image in the West. And his response was, "You said we are your adversary. Well, therefore, we don't care what our image is here and what you think of us and whether you like our policy or not." And this is part of what we are dealing with as well.
Thank you, James. Robert, I'd like you to take up 2 points. The NATO-Russia Council, are we using its potential? And the other one, strategic autonomy for Europe, the European Union.
Well, I mean, very quickly, I mean, it's all tied in, this question of I mean, first, good news, I think, for Sir Nicholas. The NRC exists. We do have meetings. They're not, of course, that frequent, and they are on ambassadorial level, but we have them, and we have discussed issues. I would boldly predict that should be one sometime this year later. We discuss issues which relate to Ukraine because Minsk agreement is fundamental to us and we would like to see Russia implemented. We discuss issues related to exercises and anything to do which can reduce the risk. Sometimes even issues like Afghanistan. And we do that. We've done some briefings, you know. But, and now to tie into the question posed by Mr. Binion, dialogue is important, and we are both in the confines of the NATO-Russia Council. There's also the military channels which can be used. We do have an office in Moscow, for example, and Saka does talk from time to time to General Gerasimov. But we need to have dialogue with the civil society. There is hardly almost a week in NATO HQ that we don't have visits of experts, of students from Russia. We do keep these channels open because they are important. That is our long-term thing. But a bit like, you know, part of the answer which Kostya has given, well, you know, the value of the dialogue is that you don't hear the other side saying things which you can watch on Russian television. I can tell you it's not a great pleasure to watch Russian television. Monsieur Jean, les questions concernant le système antimissiles. Ben, la première chose, ce n'est pas, nous ne parlons pas maintenant du système américain. Il y a le système de l'OTAN. Et ce système qui a une existence pour les raisons qui sont décidées par tous les membres de l'OTAN. Nous avons fait l'analyse des menaces ensemble. Nous avons fait l'analyse des possibilités de créer des réponses techniques à menaces qui n'originent pas en Russie. Ce système n'a aucune connexion en Russie. Et si nous parlons de propagande, bon, ça c'est malheureusement la spécialité de notre collègue russe. L'OTAN est engagé en propagande. The last point is simply that the first question posed by Mr. Binion. We can be, I mean, we can joke a little bit about this. Some of it is true, actually. We can be, if you like, grateful for Mr. Putin and the policy of Russia Federation to kind of improve the understanding of what we're dealing with. Therefore, it makes a case stronger for cooperation with the EU, for other issues. But let me assure you, NATO has plenty of things to do. We don't want to deal with that problem. We don't want Russia to be a problem. We would like to resolve some issues together with Russia. But at the moment, we cannot do that because not of our actions, but because of the actions taken by Russia. And let's not forget that.
Okay. We've got some extra time from the organizers, but time is not unlimited. So please try to confine yourselves to one point. I still have more than 10 people on the list. We continue with Rasa Jukniewicz from Lithuania.
Thank you.
Former defense minister.
Thank you. Many maybe will be surprised, but today I feel much safer, despite I came from Lithuania. Many times Baltic states were mentioned even and today, than before 2014, when very few spoke about the threats from Kremlin and Russia, despite the threats were the same we have now. Today, we have a realistic approach on the table. We discuss about strategy, and we have different, more or less, views on the future. I would like to say a little bit about feelings of guilt. And does Russia changing, or did Putin change his mind because of enlargement? I think it's one of the elements of Russian information warfare against us. Because Putin didn't change his mind. Putin was Putin when he got power. Please look backwards and look what happened in '99. Bombings in apartments in some cities, warfare against Chechnya, and other things. I will not go into the details. But Putin had a plan together, his team, KGB team, and Putin was only the top actor. So his plan was, first stage, to occupy his own country, to destroy opposition, liberal opposition, and he did that. Only after he destroyed his roots of liberalism in Russia itself, he went to the broader territory. And in 2007, he made his speech, and he used enlargement as element of warfare to feel you guilty, that you have me here around the table together with you to discuss. I don't feel guilty, because I became part of this community. My question and maybe I would like to see more elaboration on the strategy of NATO strategy on Russia. Of course, everyone around wants different Russia. So we have to concentrate on Russian people, but to be very tough on regime, because Putin will not be forever, I am sure. We have to invite Georgia to NATO as soon as possible. And we have to have special plan for Ukraine, because Ukraine is crucial for the strategy on Russia. Without Ukraine, strategy on Russia will not be working at all. Thank you.
Thanks very much. We move on to Georg Gorgisyan from Armenia. Sir.
Thank you very much. As Mr. Konstantin said, I'm totally agree. So every regime afraid just one thing, losing the power. But if we will go back to Machiavelli, as he said, sorry? Oh. Okay. Loud, okay. Oh, now it works. As Mr. Konstantin said, so every regime, it doesn't matter Putin or not, every regime afraid from one thing, just losing the power. And if we go back to Machiavelli, who said, for keeping your people silent, you need an enemy. And now the regime represents West or NATO as an enemy, and using this to keep in silent his people, to not build democracy. But if we will go like this, at the end we may have Russia something like North Korea. I'm afraid, but if it's not go to democracy way, the other way is that country. So without any discussion, just getting stronger in this way, in this side, and Russia doing something which he thinks makes him stronger or shows that he doesn't afraid from NATO. Again, the same question I asked yesterday, how you see the future, how it's going to be without negotiations and just going like this, because in this way we can just push Russia to some alliance which are worse than Russia itself. Thank you.
Much. All right, Christian Tybring-Gjedde from Norway. Okay.
Yeah, it's working there. I think Norway has a different experience with Russia and also Soviet Union for that matter. Since after World War II, when they left Norway, and they today have a good relations up north with between Russia and Norway, cultural exchanges, and as I told some of the members here, even the signs of the streets in Kirkenes is both in Russian and Norwegian. It's really a good relationship. So I think my point is due to that factor, that background. And I think we have to look at the solution for the long term. The long term meaning that who comes after Putin. It's very easy to look at Putin. He's been there now for 13 years, something like that, meaning that in a few years' time he will not be there anymore. And as long as we push Russia away from the West, or Russia is moving away from the West, whatever you look at it, a new president can argue and use that nationalistic approach to even create the West or present the West as more of an enemy than today. That is not a good solution for the West, meaning that we have to think differently. And I think since Jens Stoltenberg is a friend of mine, then I can criticize him a little bit. I think the message saying that each nation, as I said yesterday, has its right to choose its own path is a way short-sighted, and it's not correct. And as I mentioned yesterday about Cuba in 1962, or you can say Nicaragua in the 80s, the United States will never accept that they become a member of the Warsaw Pact. And so why do we keep on saying this, even though intellectually and idealistically it's correct, but it is not the fact. So we should be very careful with saying that, and I think that's a provocative statement to Russia. So we have to think long-term and you have to think about solutions, not going back and say, repeating the past and saying that all these difficult things that happened in the past and it will repeat itself. No, I don't think so. I think the Russians in general are people that we can deal with, even though the leadership is done undemocratic and it's difficult. I think we can deal with Russia in a better way than we do now, and I think the sanctions that we do now, they will never leave Crimea, even though we would think it's right that they do. They will not do it. And where did we go with the sanctions then? And the US and the European sanctions are different. US has different sanctions than the Europeans. And for a sanction regime, you need to have the same sanctions, and you need to have a goal that you can actually achieve realistically. And I don't think we can do that now. And I think it's, we are not doing the right policy. We should, I think, try to change this. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm moving on to Ambassador Robert Hunter.
Just 3 points very briefly. Number one, it is important for us to try to figure out how we got from there to here, in which we did make a lot of mistakes. I'm listening to Monsieur Boucheron, who I think put it very well. Can't summarize them here, but it wasn't all just baked into Russian DNA, what we were trying to do in the 1990s, number one. Number two, I think it is very important that we not think ourselves into a new Cold War and new rigidities, and to call people who are questioning our having to be here, to use a Leninist phrase, as somehow useful idiots. We spent a lot of time during the Cold War of people not being allowed to look at this. Third, to look at the practicalities now. What's the Russian phrase? Что делать? If I get it right, what is to be done? There are a number of practical things to be done, some of which are in the NATO-Russia Founding Act, and most particularly, the coming expiration of New START in 2021, which needs to be renegotiated, and in which there are common interests to try to prevent misunderstandings and potential conflict, and going backwards in terms of what is needed to make things safer in a common interest. And I think we need to be focused on that to a great extent.
Next is Madeleine Moon, NATO PA President.
I wonder if our greatest weakness is actually the openness of our societies. Militarily, we're getting our act together, and this is something that perhaps is more for each of us as a country. It's about building the resilience of our populations, both to the disinformation campaigns and to the fake news that is coming our way on a regular basis. And in particular, whenever we use our democratic processes in elections. We are seeing that increasingly. The further east you go, I see greater resilience. The further west I go, the weaker it seems to be. Is one of the things that we're failing to address, the resilience of our local populations.
Next is Yuri Bereza from Ukraine.
Я хочу підтвердити і підтримати пана Константина в його висловах і сказати, що от насправді в колективного Путіна кнопки, на які він тисне, є в будь-якому уряді, в будь-якому парламенті, в будь-якій країні, в тому числі в країнах НАТО. І це, на жаль, показує і події в Франції, де за жовтих жилетів виступають так звані представники ОРДЛО, які воюють на сході України, і багато інших прикладів. Але я про інше. Насправді ми чітко розуміємо, що нам прийдеться все рівно воювати з Росією. Нам, нашому народу. Для того, щоб повернути Крим, для того, щоб повернути частину, яку окупувала Росія. Без санкцій, які були прийняті, в тому числі НАТО, нам би було геть погано. Ви нам дали передишку і даєте передишку в тому, що ми відновлюємо свою армію. Але є один момент, який ви не використовуєте або ми не використовуємо. Якраз інтеграція наших, наприклад, підприємств космічної галузі. Я говорю про, наприклад, Південмаш і коли він буде інтегруватися в європейські структури, в структури НАТО, і він буде використовуватися, це буде послаблювати Росію 40-50%. І саме основний момент. Я хочу, щоб ви пам'ятали про те, що гроші Росії працюють в кожній вашій країні. Коханки, діти колективного Путіна живуть в ваших країнах. І прямого удару завдати, насправді, по дітях вони не зроблять ніколи. Вони будуть бити Україну, будуть бити Грузію, будуть бити Молдову, будуть бити, ну, мабуть, вже не будуть бити, але б хотіли дуже вдарити по країнам Балтії. І це абсолютна правда, тому що ви самі на початку говорили про рівень підтримки кривавого диктатора Сталіна. На сьогоднішній день це новий ідол Росії. Не Путін, а Сталін. Дякую.
Thank you very much. We move on with Bob Stewart from the UK.
Thank you, Roland. Very well moderated and great speeches from everyone. Thank you. In 1944, the Russians had a superb army. When NATO was formed, we took that image of the Russian expertise in warfare wholesale, and we actually thought of the Russians as being supermen in a way. I speak as an ex-infantry intelligence officer from Germany. And we thought that all the way through until the Soviet Union collapsed. And then we discovered they weren't as good as they should have been, or as we thought they were. My question is, how good is the Russian military now after its modernization? And how effective would Russian forces be if, we hope not, of course, they were actually to be used against NATO? Thank you.
And we move on to Sangulyan from Azerbaijan.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask Mr. Speakers, how do they comment this kind of provocative ideas that confrontation between Russia and great Western countries are beneficial both sides? In this situation, small countries are becoming more obedient. That's why West didn't help properly to build democracy in Russia in time after collapse of Soviet Union. And that's why USA and UK, having every opportunity to protect territorial integrity of Ukraine as a guarantee country, but they did nothing. At that time, it was enough that what USA announced that what UK and USA will defend territorial integrity of Ukraine, but Mr. Obama told that if Russia will occupy Crimea, USA will impact sanction on Russia. It was a green light to occupy Crimea. Thank you very much.
Boris Tarasyuk, former Foreign Minister of Ukraine.
Thank you. I would like to praise the information provided by distinguished panelists. And let me quote one of you. We do not want Russia to be the problem. End of quotation. It doesn't depend on you. It doesn't depend on NATO, on the whole civilized world. It depends on Russia. Russia is the problem. And now let me share with my view on what happened. In 2014, when Russia made an aggression against Ukraine, we saw the paralysis of the political will within NATO and leading capitals, including Washington, Berlin. What we heard at these first days of Russian aggression from these capitals do not do anything to provoke Russia. This was the recommendation coming from Washington, from Bonn and other capitals. So instead of mobilizing its political, military, economic strength, there were conversations, which continues now, and the search for the compromise, as though it was not Russia, but the united Western democracies did something wrong. And you, the united democracies, are looking for the compromises. Even in non-military reaction, we do not see the unity. The policy of European Union, of Washington on sanctions against Russia is being under corrosion. So the proof, yes, please, the statement and the letter by the German ambassador to Washington, the activity of German delegation in Strasbourg to protect Russia from sanctions in the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. So we may continue this list of how to appease Russia, not to put on danger the basic interests of the democratic world. So my question is, don't you think that we have overseen the destruction of fundamentals of international law and of international and global peace order as a result of Russian behavior? So don't you think that military might and economic strength is being materialized in the influence on the global affairs? Thank you.
With all appreciation to all speakers and due respect, but if I were in your shoes when analyzing how did we get from there to here, I would start by the war in Chechnya and by how the aspirations of the Chechnyan people were suppressed with the toleration of the international community. And secondly, I would be more assertive on how the inaction in Syria by the Western international community due to lack of coherence triggered what happened in Ukraine and Crimea. And again, how the symbolic nature of sanctions after illegal annexation of Crimea has triggered the permanent deployment in Syria. And also I join former Foreign Minister of Ukraine on the nature of Western response. We got the same advices after we shut down the Russian plane. Be careful, don't provoke, don't escalate. So this is not the way indeed to deal with Russia. Thank you.
Georgi Kandelaki from Georgia.
Thank you. I understand that the analogy of Cuba joining the Warsaw Pact is a very attractive one, but it needs some more scrutiny. One has to remember that no member of the Warsaw Pact joined it voluntarily, because no member of the Warsaw Pact had government that represented will of its people. And for that matter, Georgia too didn't join the Soviet Union voluntarily. It ended up in the Soviet Union as a result of a full-scale war that lasted for 1 month, in which, perhaps it would be interesting for our French colleague, the French Navy took part on the Georgian side upon orders of Prime Minister Aristide Briand. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Now, the Herculean task of answering at least some of these points. We will start with Robert, move on to Konstantin, and James Scher is going to have the last word. Robert.
Okay, 3 clusters points. First, the answer to Mr. Tybring-Gjedde. Well, I'm in a good position. My boss is Mr. Stoltenberg, and not you, so all due respect to your views, I'd rather stick to his interpretation of international law. Let me just remind everybody that this question of the sovereign choice of the security arrangements for each country, it has been adopted by the OSCE. And it applies to everybody, small, medium-sized, large countries, those who have a lot of fish, those who have oil, those who are landlocked countries. It's a principle. We can't really, so it's not about political correctness. And I remember my boss, Mr. Stoltenberg, he got a similar question, if I recall, during one of the NPA meetings in Warsaw, and he actually responded by talking about the situation in country 1949. It was a sovereign choice of each country, including the funded members, and that's how it should remain. But I'll leave it at that. But second point, I think these questions, the points made, they show that there is, I mean, this is where the strength of NATO lies, in its diversity. There are different sensitivities, different historical experiences, and that's how it should be. But unity is the key to almost everything. It is, I think, a key to answering the question posed by Madam President about resilience, very important point, because you build resilience, but actually utilizing the good examples of others, how countries deal with NATO countries and non-NATO countries, like Sweden, Finland, for example, disinformation, how you analyze the situation, how you deal with hybrid, difficult issues, cyber attacks. I mean, surely I think most of the parliaments of NATO countries have experienced cyber attacks. Well, again, you stress it, meaning you address the issue to the extent together then to know. Second, unity helps to keep appeasement in bay. Yes. Minister Tarasyuk, well, of course, nothing is ideal in the world, and there are many cases where, well, various things are said or done which may diverge from. But that is even more the reason why we should cherish this unity. And frankly speaking, if we have a policy which has been agreed, in this case by 29, well, it's implemented, and it has many elements. As I said, on a military side, on a political side, on the public debate side, there is a lot of things that need to be done. Last question, I don't know, Stuart, who I always will remember the wonderful hospitality you've shown during one of these. Now, I cannot, of course, talk too much in public about the details of how we analyze. Of course, we analyze this, and the allies do that individually. But I think the simplest way to describe the challenge is that it would be a big mistake to underestimate the Russian military ability to essentially do harm. They have displayed it. And let's not forget, it's not just the capabilities themselves, but it's actually the willingness to use military tool as part of your policy. That has been, that's once you do it without paying due attention to international rules, then there is a temptation to do it again. But at the same time, yes, we should not develop some kind of a fetish or bogus. We have stood up as an alliance to various challenges of this nature in the past, including at a time where perhaps, Soviet Union could claim that it really was in control of a very, very large, not just arsenal, but even, if you like, the destiny of so many countries. This is not the case. And the Warsaw Pact didn't just disappear. The countries dissolved it because they didn't want it. That is one of the biggest advantages we have. We're the alliance of the countries that want to be members. Thank you.
Thank you. Konstantin. And please also refer to this question about how to address the next generation of Russians and the next generation of Russian leaders.
Yes. Before I answer, I'd like to ask a question of my own. C'est une question, Monsieur le Boucheron. Vous avez commencé votre intervention en disant que la Russie n'a pas la tradition de la démocratie, qui est partiellement vrai. Mais est-ce que c'est une manière douce de dire que les Russes sont les esclaves de l'âme et que la Russie est destinée de rester la dictature pour toujours. Dans cette situation, bien sûr, il faut s'engager avec n'importe quel régime et sans les principes. Si c'est votre position, je voudrais vous clarifier ça pour moi.
En un mot, chers collègues, je crois qu'il faut rompre les relations diplomatiques immédiatement avec l'Arabie Saoudite.
Okay. Oui, okay. Yeah, okay. Merci. I'll switch to English now. I think that generally, I'd like to, there were many questions and there were many, addresses by the honourable members of parliaments, which were more statements of facts than questions. But I'll try to sum up what I wanted to say about the future. And I think it's a very important issue to engage with the future of Russia. As one of, I think, of the British colleagues said, no one can beat nature. And evidently, the current Russian leadership is physically on its way out. I happen to travel across Russia all the time. I visit 5-6 new Russian regions every year. I deal a lot with the young people. Believe me, for all of them, be them liberals, communists, monarchists, this current leadership means absolutely nothing. For them, it's just a bunch of granddaddies who don't understand modernity. And I think that this is lesson number one we have to deal with. We have to figure out that in the last 20 years, we have the so-called Putin generation in Russia, which has 3 distinct characteristics. It's a generation that's used to making all sorts of choices, consumer choices, personal choices. It's a first choice generation in Russia, which at the same time doesn't have one specific choice to make and never experienced it. And that is the choice to elect their own representatives. Number 2 is a generation which for the first time is complete. It lived all its life in the age of the internet and social networks. They know how to get information, if they want to. And I think a very important issue is how to make people more curious, how to make them want to learn about the world. And number 3, those of you who read Robert Musil's famous novel, Man Without Qualities, remember this is the last years of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So everyone at that time lived most of their lives, all their lives, in the age of Emperor Franz Joseph. So we have the generation which has never seen any other ruler in Russia but Vladimir Putin. I think these 3 elements will eventually have a very significant impact on developments in Russia. If I knew who's going to be the next Russian leader, next Russian leadership, I would have been flying here in a personal jet and charging 10,000 euros an hour for my consultation. I don't know. But one thing I can tell you, this necessity, this constant confrontation with the outside world, that's the only way for the current Russian regime to survive. Because it can't provide economic renewal in Russia with 60% of Russian GDP being produced by inefficient and corrupt state-owned enterprises. Putin is not going to liberalize the economy because that will mean basically ridding his own circle of huge income. And that means that this pressure cooker will continue to rot away like a Titanic that continues to sail on until some kind of accident will not produce a collapse of this regime. I do not believe in the Perestroika 2, new Gorbachev, because as opposed to the Politburo, people who run Russia are not politicians. There is only one politician in Russia. His name is Vladimir Putin. So I think that one has to prepare and one has to engage right now with the weak, dispossessed, but still existing civic society in Russia. You have to be very, very strong about your values. And I think you have to do what Rasa said, the honorable former defense minister of Lithuania. You have to engage with the Russian people, and you have to engage with the Russian regime. But you have to engage in a different way, believe me. That is very, very important. There's one thing you have to show to the regime and another thing to the Russian people. I think Boris Johnson, that's the last thing I'm going to say. Boris Johnson, who is much maligned, he came to Moscow in late 1917, when he was still foreign secretary, and addressed a university and said, we extend the hand of friendship to the Russian people. We do not extend our hand to the Russian regime. I think that's an extremely important fact, and an extremely important policy position, which one has to stick to if one wants to see Russia not as a permanent dictatorship always threatening the world, but rather a country that will eventually, I don't know, in 50 or 100 years, evolve to a partner of the West.
Thank you, Konstantin. James.
Distinguished Assembly will forgive my candor. Let me confine myself maximally to 4 extremely brief points, and if I'm cut off, to 3. The Cold War ended because Russia agreed with us and committed itself to the establishment in Europe, in the OSCE area, to a state of affairs in which spheres of influence would no longer be recognized, in which all states would be regarded as independent and sovereign and able and free to choose their partners and make their own choices. And if you have forgotten what is in the Paris Charter, even the NATO Russia Founding Act, which Russia signed, I urge you to go back and read all of this. If the time should come when a consensus of 29 NATO members concludes we are no longer committed to these principles, either because they were wrong, either because they are too inexpensive, either because they are too inconvenient, either because the Russians will not agree, well, then NATO will make that decision. But we have not made that decision as of now. Secondly, I will have the temerity to comment on a Norwegian perspective because a Norwegian perspective was presented. And I am privileged to spend a fair amount of time in your country, sir, and even to have toured the border in Finnmark during the Cold War. I hope that Norwegians who enjoy the relationship you describe with Russia are very thankful and appreciative of the fact that they do not fall within a country that Russia regards as part of its historical zone of influence. You do not. The country I live in now, Estonia, is within Russia's historical zone of influence. I was in the room when one of the most senior Russian policymakers and representatives stated in 2014 that Moldova and the Baltic states need to consider events in Ukraine and draw conclusions for themselves. The Russians today do not regard the legal and political borders of the West as legitimate. They accept them because of a balance of forces and because of judgments about risk. But they are not seen as legitimate borders of the West. The legitimate borders of the West, with some modifications, are seen still today to be the Nicer River. I trust also that Norway is a member of NATO because Norway understands it can have no security in and of itself unless it is connected with the security of 28 others and is committed to their security as much as they are committed to Norway's security. Third, I personally will never accept that we must become perfect people before we have the right to defend our allies or to give our partners the confidence and the support to be able to defend themselves in collaboration with us. My last final point in connection with this is all in connection with what Edward Lucas correctly called whataboutism. With people who talk about the United States and Central America, for all the criticisms that we can make about policy there historically, consider one question. How many people were liquidated between the proclamation of the Monroe Doctrine and the present day in pursuit of American hegemony? 25,000? 50,000? Pick a number. It's about that sort of number. How many were liquidated in the course of the creation of the Soviet Union? Leave aside other things. 5 million? 10 million? 15 million? It's an entirely different history. It's an entirely different reality for people who have gone through that experience. For countries that have seen a third of their populations deported, a fifth liquidated between 1939 and 1941. For Eastern Poland as well, this is a different reality. Please suspend, please curb your temptation to construct easy analogies with things that are not analogous. Let me simply leave it there. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, James, for this passionate flourish at the end. I would normally give you now the takeaways of what we've all been talking about, but I will spare you this. We will go into the coffee break and then try to start on time for the next session. Thank you, all of you, and especially to the speakers.
No, listen, we need to talk about this Russophile thing, because he asked me yesterday whether I'm a Russophile.
Ja, wat moet ik nu zeggen? Ja, nu werkt dat niet. Hallo? Ja.
I was thinking about this question at home. In some way, I am a but you mean definition?
Yeah, exactly. In my case, it's just Russia has.
I think we've got the pendulum has.
Yeah, my kids are teenagers.
I would very much prefer to
I would
see
like
more.
Really?
Oh yeah.
I'm really enjoying my time.
Early on the Friday.
I've just been from my daughter.
You got fired from your job.
Thank you very much.
Hello. And then my son, no, if he got fired, he would pick
Hallo.
later left drunk.
Hallo. Is het niet beter?
So where do you... Zeg eens iets.
Hallo. Ja, het is hetzelfde. Dezelfde halm. Het is een halm, hè. En dat komt van die...
Oh, were you? I was a soldier.
En deze? Probeer een andere. Ja. Hallo. Misschien? Nee, het is hetzelfde halm. Het is net dezelfde halm. Hallo.
why should we?
This has become almost our most important partner. So we have, we actually have an office in Brussels, which, so, and we interact with them almost on a weekly basis.
Wow, okay.
So I will, in June, I will come back. Then, we'll try to organize something like a decaf week in Brussels, but, on the interface between us and the Union.
Different. It's with the EAS and the European Parliament, or
no,
the EAS?
with the EAS and the Commission.
Yeah.
So the Parliament is slightly different, of course. So it's really fairly operationally oriented. So we do a lot with them, in the Sahel, for instance, in the Western Balkans. So we, we have received a mandate to be together with a consortium of organizations, to be the lead organization for the next few years in providing all the EU delegations across the globe with specific expertise when they implement SSR programs or projects, and when they have a need for more specific expertise, which is almost, not always, but very often the case.
Lots of organizations that they work with, but do you see that privileged partnership?
Clearly defined field.
The question: what can each organization contribute?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. There's always a challenge of a coordination challenge, and then the DNAs of the organization is very different.
Merci.
Thank you.
Shoot. before you...
Work. 1, 2, yeah, that's fine. So, yeah. Can I ask all of you to take your seats so we can start this final panel? We can start. I guess we can start now this final session. Thank you to all of you for still being here. My name is Roxandra Popa. I'm the Deputy Secretary General of the NATO PA, and it's my privilege to conclude what I think we all agree has been a fascinating day and a half of discussions of the Rose-Roth program, its origins, its contributions, NATO partnerships, and the future. And this is exactly what our session is supposed to focus on, and I'm very happy to have some reinforcements here at the head table to talk about the future. And I do sincerely hope that we'll get also some contributions from the floor. After all, we're meeting in a parliament, so it should really be you talking and not us talking at you. But so the theme for our final panel, it's supposed to be a brainstorming session about the future of the Rose-Roth program, and more broadly how the Assembly's relations with its partners relates with NATO's partnerships. And I think before I give the floor to my panelists today and I introduce them, what I'd like to start with is a little bit of a summary of yesterday's discussions, because I think we had a lot of very interesting insights and also some initial ideas about the future. So I just wanted to come back to some of the points that were raised yesterday. First of all, about the origins of the Rose-Roth program, because I think if we're going to talk about the future, it's important to come back to the spirit, the original spirit of the program. And what stuck with me was Simon Lunn's recollection of the creation of the program, and Charlie Rose's, Charlie Rose saying, okay, it's great that we have a dialogue with the countries of the former Warsaw Pact and that we engage in an exchange with them, but what can we do, what can the Assembly actually do to help? So I think this idea of what can we do, I think we need to keep that in mind as well in our discussions about the future. I would also like to refer also, going back to the original spirit of the Rose-Roth program, to the intervention by Ambassador Olivieri of Switzerland, who said in her view, in Switzerland's view, there were three important pillars to the Rose-Roth program, and that was dialogue, exchange of expertise, and the promotion of democracy. And I think Ian Brzezinski, in his intervention, added the fourth dimension, and several other speakers talked about that, and which was the support for NATO enlargement. So building support in NATO member countries for enlargement, and then assisting candidates to NATO membership with the reform process. So that was, for me, the key takeaways from our discussions about the origins of the program. Then we had a second part of the discussion, which was about the achievements of the program and the added value of the program. And I think the achievements came very clearly from actually the former customers. So we heard a Lithuanian perspective, we heard a Ukrainian perspective, a Georgian perspective, and a Bosnian perspective about how the program has helped each of these countries through their reform process and through their accession to NATO. And in terms of the added value of the program, again, I would like to refer back to one of Simon's point, which was the reason why the Assembly could sometimes be ahead of NATO in reaching out to partners, even in the early days, was the flexibility that the Assembly has, because we decide by majority. We're a parliament, and so we decide by majority vote, where NATO has to have consensus. And so in some cases, the Assembly was able to be ahead of NATO in some of our decisions in our outreach to partners. So again, I think that's something we should keep in mind for our discussion this morning, is we know the Assembly can sometimes help NATO by actually being ahead and testing new ideas, testing new formats. So how should we do that in the future? Now, turning to the way ahead, again, some of the speakers yesterday mentioned a few ideas that I think are relevant for our discussion. First was, Ian Brzezinski saying we actually have a lot of unfinished business in terms of NATO enlargement. So let's talk about that and how we can continue to use the Rose-Roth program as a channel for helping NATO aspirants reach their objective. Denis Samut spoke about, do we need a Rose-Roth Plus, and what kind of a toolbox do we have to support NATO partners? And he mentioned as key areas of focus of the program, parliamentary oversight and confidence building. And so how can we build around that? What tools we can develop in our toolbox to support these two goals of parliamentary oversight and confidence building? Then we had a discussion about we have a core group of partners in our Euro-Atlantic area, but are there new regions where actually we could assist? And North Africa was mentioned in the discussion. James Mackey from NATO talked also about China and Asia and the development of NATO's relations with China and Asia. So that's another possible area of expansion of the program. And finally, former President Raza Yuknevichiene said, what we really need is new dreamers, that Charlie Rose and Bill Roth were the dreamers of their time and had this vision for this program. And what we need today is to, again, dream about the future of the Rose-Roth program. So I hope we'll get a little bit of that today, of the beginnings of a dream of where all of you want to take the Rose-Roth program in the future. So with this introduction, let me now introduce our co-panelists. And again, I'm delighted to have both of them here because they both represent institutions that have been extremely supportive of the Rose-Roth program and with which the Assembly works still very closely, not only on partnerships, but more broadly. I have with me first Thomas Gerber, who's the director of the of DCAF, the Geneva Institute for the Democratic Control of the Armed Forces, who's our main operational partner in implementing the Rose-Roth program. And I have Ruben Diaz-Playa, who works in the Secretary General's office, the policy planning unit, but has also been involved in work in partnerships at NATO and also at the OSCE. So I think I very much look forward to hearing their contributions to the discussion. And we talked a little bit about the way we're going to approach this discussion. And where I'd like to start is maybe take a step back and look at how do we expect partnerships to evolve in the future, both from a demand perspective, so from the partners' perspective, how do partners see their relations with NATO evolving in the future, and also from NATO's perspective, what is going to drive the change in NATO's partnerships? How do we expect NATO's engagement with the partners to change in the future? And how far can NATO's network of partners extend? So maybe I'll start with Ambassador Gerber and then give the floor to Ruben to discuss, how do we expect partnerships to evolve in the future? It should work.
Can you? Thank you very much, Roxandra. Right Honourable Mr. Thierry, our host, Madam President, Secretary General, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. It's a delight for me to be here, be part of the 100th seminar, Rose-Roth seminar, my first attendance. After having attended the previous discussions, I think I regret that it is my first attendance, but it will certainly not be my last. And let me also, first of all, take the opportunity to thank, the PA Secretariat, the current Secretary General David, but also Simon and the future one, Roxandra, for what I would describe as a truly, successful and quite exemplary cooperation we've been able to develop over the last 20 years. It's also been a discovery for me in different ways. For instance, I've learned through Simon, incidentally yesterday, that my organization was actually established in his office at the time, 20 years ago. This is a detail I was not aware of. Let me also take the opportunity to thank the Swiss government, which has made this cooperation possible all the years. And I think from the signals we picked up yesterday, I think that should certainly continue. DCAF, when it was founded in 2000, was very much, as some of you may remember, focused obviously on the Partnership for Peace framework, and also geographically the related catchment area, Eastern Europe, the Western Balkans. Today we are a globally active organization. We have activities in over 70 countries. And we have stayed we have stayed, you know, true to some of our basic principles, which is we are continue to be, of course, an impartial and a neutral organization based on a set of values which are very similar to NATO's values, and that is what has been the core of our cooperation also, despite the fact that NATO, of course, has always been a military alliance. Yesterday, I found it also extremely fascinating, you know, also as a historian, which is what I used to be before assuming these, you know, more international functions, to learn more about the context in '89 and thereabouts, you know, connected to the creation of the Rose-Roth seminar, but also our cooperation and the fact that, you know, obviously it was all about you know, the need to secure a stable transition and a stable transition dynamic by helping former adversaries, which now are independent states, you know, on their way to establish democratic societies based on the rule of law and based also on functioning parliamentary structures, of course, and prepare for NATO and also EU in some cases accession. So I think the main focus area, the approaches we have developed, you know, be they that this framework has given political and psychological reassurance to some of those transition states. You know, the seminars have prepared the accession and the integration into NATO assembly structures. You know, our discussions have been able to sensitize those partner countries to the requirements of parliamentary oversight, accountability, transparency, notions like that, and they have helped to build capacity, of course, in many cases. We've done it through different formats, you know, in different configurations, always with a heavy focus on what David highlighted yesterday, and that's the focus on the notion of the democratic control of armed forces. That really hasn't changed at all. So if we compare this, and it brings me back to Roxandra's question, you know, on the demand, on the structure of the demand, how we perceive it. You know, has anything changed which should lead us to, you know, more fundamentally challenge or question or discuss the future of the seminars or not? And here I would echo some of what also has been said yesterday, in that, you know, stability and security in the Euro-Atlantic space, in our perception certainly, is still a major area of concern. So I would echo what Ian said. You know, the notion of unfinished business is very appropriate in many instances. You know, we see reversals and setbacks in some cases, which proves that democracy is never you know, a linear process. It's very much you know, a continuous effort to strengthen what needs to be strengthened. And also, I think, due to the fact that parliamentary structures such as this structure is characterized by a high level of rotation, I think that makes it necessary to continuously you know, sensitize our partners to these issues. So, you know, on top of all of these well-known challenges, what I would also say that we've seen in the last few years, you know, a number of newer challenges which are highly relevant for parliaments as well. So we've, for instance, seen that some of the value frameworks on which we have based our work, you know, have not been, you know, there has been agreement on what they should be, but if you look at the operational realities of the implementation side, what we find globally, but also relevant for, you know, the geographical space represented here, we see more and more antagonism between those two dimensions. So we see large agreement about values in abstract, but that does not always translate into consistent operational realities. Also, we have seen, and you know, Madeleine has, you know, on several occasions emphasized the fact that, you know, the tendency in certain cases towards more authoritarian realities. You know, that goes along with, you know, often a weakening of parliamentary structures. You know, transfer of power to the executive side of the system, which comes with a lot of challenges, to do with your work. And I think, we have an interest in discussing those as consciously as we can and see what it means for our work. So we've also seen, when I was earlier talking about a set of principles which unites us and values, we've, in the last few years, globally seen what I would describe as an erosion of the rules-based approach, fairly much across the board. And it came up in many of the discussions about specific contexts that we've had in the last couple of days. As a consequence of this increasing emphasis on more power political intentions rather than normative values, we've also seen a sharp increase of arms transfers, for instance, across the globe, but including across this region, which concerns us here. And the balance between, between the strengthening of military capacity versus sound governance systems, has suffered from that tendency in certain cases. So again, if we want to uphold the notion that good governance should continue to play a crucial role in all contexts, I think that would have to lead us to some discussions about this phenomenon. So, to come back to what needs to be changed, I don't think there's any room for complacency. I think much of what has been done in the past continues to be highly relevant, and that includes, what we've seen in the last session, which is a very healthy, a healthy exchange, a possibility of exchange of political viewpoints. I mean, this is, it cannot get more democratic than this. But at the same time, I think a conscious effort to look at some of those more recent challenges and trends and ask ourselves, what do they mean for us and for you as parliamentarians? And this is where DCAF can bring in some expertise, and they may well lead to a different emphasis on certain topics, in the future, which have not been at the center of past programs of this seminar. So this, in a nutshell, is how I would summarize the demand and the change of the demand. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Lots of very interesting ideas there about the new challenges that partners face and that we face within NATO, and how these can provide new avenues for the Rose-Roth program to think about. Ruben, can you give us a little bit of a sense of NATO's, the way NATO, you work in the policy planning unit. This is the unit that thinks about the future and where NATO is heading. So how do you see partnerships, the future of partnerships?
Yes, thank you very much, Alexandra. And it's really a great pleasure for me to be here today in honor as well on this august occasion of the 100th Rose-Roth Seminar. And I thank you all, Madam President and Secretary General, for your invitation. I will also start with a little disclaimer in the sense that I will not necessarily speak for the Secretary General or for NATO in an official capacity. It's more in a brainstorming mode here, and actually that's a lot of what we do in the policy planning unit. So in that sense, I'm happy to share my thoughts. I'm particularly keen to discuss this because I come from in my personal background, I used to work on NATO partnerships, and before my NATO incarnation, I used to work at the OSCE, where I actually worked with parliaments to strengthen parliaments through cooperation programs in Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans. So it's a subject close to my heart. If we look at partnerships, I think I'm going to disappoint you, Roxandra. I don't have a secret plan for how partnerships will evolve. We don't have a map somewhere in our office that says our 25-year plan for where we're going to go next on partnerships. Why? Because we don't have a map like that about NATO. My first point is that NATO partnerships follow NATO's agenda, and that we've seen that over the last 25, 30 years or so. It's been an integral part of NATO's political and other tools. If you follow how NATO's agenda has evolved over the last 25 years, partnerships have always evolved with that. So if you look at the early 1990s, partnerships were really crucial to that early confidence building and early outreach and dialogue and discussion with the newly liberated countries of Eastern Europe. And as the decade moved on, we went into stabilization and crisis management, and partners were, of course, an integral part of that. And then as enlargement moved up the agenda, the partnership mechanism was essential for building institutional capacity, for building resilience, building and helping in transformation of states and societies. And so with that, I would say that, we've also seen that trend over the last few years. The Secretary General in his speech a few years ago said that NATO has had 3 eras. The era of collective defense, which roughly ended with the Cold War, the era of what he calls projecting stability, which was the sort of post-Cold War era, the 1990s into the 2000s, and he says we're now in a 3rd era. And the 3rd era is actually where we are called to do both. Since 2014, we do both collective defense and deterrence, but also we do projecting stability. And we're learning right now what it means to do both those tasks at the same time. But partnership matters to both those tasks. And we're seeing that in very interesting ways. I think that the functions that I outlined earlier and that you also discussed yesterday still matter. That kind of dialogue and discussion, the assurance, the providing, building confidence, building awareness of what NATO is and is not, is fundamental. And of course, the Rose-Roth seminar will be essential for that in the future as well. I think that also the enlargement task, we shall not overlook that. I think that obviously the number of candidates to enlargement has reduced over the years. Back in the 1990s, a number of our partners were candidates for enlargement. Now it's a smaller number, but a significant group are still there. So that task will remain essential. Of course, if you look at the geography of partnerships, I don't expect that we will, that our immediate neighborhood as NATO will matter. Why? Because that is NATO's core business, is its immediate neighborhood, is its geographical area. There is a geographical focus inscribed into the Washington Treaty, so it would be strange for us not to focus on what is in our area of concern. That said, we have seen a kind of a global turn in our partnerships. James yesterday discussed it, and it is a reality now. Why? Because the sort of global security landscape is seeing an increasing blurring of what is global and what is local, and we're seeing many trends, many challenges that are being faced in Europe are also happening elsewhere. So that's why it helps to talk to our partners especially like-minded partners further beyond. So I'd say that globalization of partnerships, I think, is here to stay. But as I said, we don't have a plan of who we're going to go to next, because that is not how partnership works. It is, as the Swiss ambassador yesterday said, it is a two-way street. It also very much works with the demand that not only NATO has, but also partners have itself. I think that the example of our first Latin American partner, Colombia, is instructive in this regard. This is something that happened slowly, step by step, a series of initial contacts. It went as far as the allies were keen to go, but it was something that also, where there was a clear set of gains also for the alliance. This is a country that was transitioning out of civil war, that was considering how to reform its armed forces so that it could do more deployed operations in future to support peacekeeping. So in some ways we're helping a country to become a security provider, but also has a series of niche expertise areas in counter-insurgency, in how to integrate gender into civil and military affairs in conflict, how to do counter-narcotics, and is also a bit of a training hub for Latin America. So there was a clear win-win with this country, and this is why Colombia, became NATO's most recent partner. So if that sort of dynamic continues, I can expect another number of other countries eventually to join our group. But as I said, there is no master plan. Let me say a quick couple of words on the substance of partnerships, and I'm happy to go further on that in our discussion. I think that the functions we mentioned earlier of partnership and also the parliamentary engagement component, I think those all still stand, but we have also seen an increasing focus within our partnership work over the last few years on, for instance, defense capacity building, especially in countries in our neighborhood. We sense the importance of building the resilience of our institutions in our neighboring countries. And so I think there's a natural fit between this focus, this forum here, sorry, and the work that we're doing on defense capacity building. Why? Because more resilient defense institutions require democratic oversight if those institutions are to be used for the benefit of citizens and not against them. And that is where parliaments can play a key role. The other aspect I would say here, of course, is looking at the nature of the security environment we face. And we are seeing an increasingly society-centric form of security challenges. That is to say, adversaries or malign actors trying to exploit divisions within our own societies for their own gain. I would say that is the case for what we've seen, what we call hybrid warfare, but also terrorism. Terrorism is meant to accentuate the divisions between groups in society. So that means the implication of that is, unlike the Cold War, the front lines for our security don't necessarily run geographically. They also run straight through chambers such as these. And you, as parliamentarians, are the first line of response in some cases. You, as political influencers, you as voices in society, are the first line of response in maintaining the integrity and the strength of our institutions and not allowing forces from outside to disrupt and to play our institutions against themselves. So that, I think, is another angle to look at in terms of the work you do with Rose-Roth. How do you strengthen the resilience of parliaments, of parliamentarians, how to make them aware of the security situations that we face, the techniques and the tactics that are used against them, that are used against our societies. That would be a fascinating subject, I think, for you to move, and have other thoughts as well if you want to go at that.
And that's great, lots of interesting ideas there. We had discussed a number of follow-up questions, but I see that we already have a number of members wanting to take the floor, so I'll go straight to them because I want to make sure that whoever wants to contribute to this discussion has a chance. And I'll take 3 questioners at a time, starting with Bob Stewart from the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much. My question is particularly to Thomas Gerber. Switzerland is the most armed nation in Europe, yet it has no army, and it's pretty professional. In 1994-95, I was sent by NATO, SHAPE actually, when I was Chief of Policy, to speak at the Swiss Ministry of Defense to convince them about the value of peacekeeping. Since then, the Swiss Army has carried out peacekeeping operations in some form or other. Could I ask you, Thomas, because you actually rejoice under the title of coming from the Geneva Center for Democratic Control of the Armed Forces, could you tell me what the purpose of the Swiss Armed Forces is? I almost know the answer, it's a neutral country, but what is the intention abroad using Swiss Armed Forces?
Thank you. Next on my list is Oyars Kalnins.
I'd like to talk about the future of the Rose-Roth process. Ever since I've been in Parliament, my focus is on foreign affairs, and I've found that these seminars are extremely valuable beyond NATO, but on foreign affairs in general. But the question is, as we know, Karl Lammers now is focusing on education and educating youth. Has a Rose-Roth seminar ever been held at a university? And we engage with other parliamentarians, we meet in parliaments, but what about the next level down, the future parliamentarians, future policymakers? Have we ever considered that possibility of engaging with students, either in a partner country or, for that member, a member country, to help educate people about the purpose of NATO and talking to them? And I think it would be a fascinating interchange between parliamentarians and students, both in panels and in the discussion. It's just a thought for the future.
Thank you, Oyars. And the third questioner is Genci Niman-Beju from Montenegro.
Thank you, Roxandra. I will also, my intervention is basically focused maybe on future of Rose-Roth for Western Balkans, where I'm coming from. So basically, I'm free to notice and to share my opinion, political opinion with you, that from 2013 onwards, we have deterioration of political discussion in Western Balkans. Even many political leaders from Western Balkans will not admit that. So basically, because I'm a new member in this assembly, and maybe a lot of the people are new, we need from time to time to reestablish or to do new things which already we have done. So my intervention is going in this direction. We need to establish with the Rose-Roth seminars a new political dialogue, friendship dialogue between our Western Balkan countries. To be not friends with each other in the beginning, but more friendly. And with this starting a new dialogue, I believe that we will go in direction which all want to be partners in the region, and as such partners to be partners with NATO or with the European Union. That's why I'm thinking that this kind of seminars are very important, and this assembly is a political assembly. We have the power and we have the opportunity to improve our relations in Western Balkans. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll start with Thomas, if you wanted to start with the question about Switzerland specifically, and then both of you, if you wanted to react to the ideas proposed about how can we extend the initiative to also engage the youth and future political leaders and the regional dimension in the Western Balkans.
Well, thank you very much. Maybe first to Mr. Stewart's question. So I'm not, my role here is not principally to justify, Switzerland's security policy or military policy strategy. My role would rather be to look on it critically from the perspective of a center, a technical capacity which reunites on its governing structure 63 different member states. So, but I will nevertheless indicate, of course, that the notion of neutrality has always been a very important one when it comes to justifying, the military capacities and its development in Switzerland. And the purpose has always been a purely, dissuasive one, of course, and that's firmly enshrined in the Constitution also. So whether the capacity is too, disproportionate to the objective, that is an ongoing discussion. And the capacity, when you talk about the most heavily armed country, different views on it and different interpretations, and it's the political process in the country which determines, what the strength should be. But what I would, like to say, you also made the linkage to peacekeeping and, investing into a more secure environment, which is something Switzerland has very actively also done, including, for instance, through this program. So under the Partnership for Peace umbrella, I think the country has tried to make a contribution within what is constitutionally possible, of course, towards a more secure environment. And it leads me to this maybe other point which Ruben mentioned earlier, the fact that DCAF is an organization which works in networks. So our partnership structure does not follow, of course, the NATO agenda. Our partnership dynamic is determined by who can contribute to improving best practice and documenting best practice. Which partners can contribute to having more persuasive answers to challenges in the security sector, so as to improve it. And that has led us increasingly to invest into a strengthening of the cooperation between different multilateral structures. So we have very tight, strategic, I should say, relationships with the UN, for instance, with the EU, with the OSCE, and also with NATO. But, when I recently talked to your boss, Alejandro Alvaro Gonzalez, he told me that, often within the NATO context, and it's probably due to the fact that NATO is, a little bit, kind of an insular structure, which, everything is contained in a building, and it's not easy for NATO to liaise easily with some of the external partners. That has increased very, very significantly, but it can still increase more. And when we, for instance, carry out comparative studies between the UN, OSCE, the European Union, and the African Union in terms of, what these organizations do to reinforce the security sectors of the countries where they're active, NATO, could benefit from such a, comparative perspective. And I think so the interest that we would have is to network NATO discussions more systematically into broader discussions, so that we can benefit from what has been developed as best practice in other places. So this is maybe to the partnership dimension, and then the last questions. I would agree with both proposals. We should test maybe new formats, addressed to younger constituencies, and it has been a long-standing effort to sensitize new parliamentarians to the challenges, and I think there have been discussions on how that can be done more effectively. So I think we should be open to these ideas, but we should not at the same time, because of that, weaken the emphasis on what is established and what has worked very well in the past. And if that can lead to more regional, you were talking about the Western Balkans configurations, I think that can also be very useful.
So yes, I think just I'll start with I won't comment too long on the Switzerland point, but I certainly would second the ambassador's points regarding the nature of partnerships. I think you're being quite modest also about the role that Switzerland has played. It is an extraordinary contributor to NATO's Partnership for Peace. When I was working on partnerships, we were working across a range of domains with Switzerland, and in part because of the extraordinary capacities that are present in Switzerland, such as DCAF itself. But it's very much been a two-way street in that sense. Switzerland has also contributed a number of perspectives and policy ideas into NATO, for instance, on issues to do with human security, and that's been something that has really enriched NATO in many ways. And of course, yes, the contribution to peacekeeping and that expertise is well known, and actually has been seen in the context of NATO operations, in particular in the Western Balkans and Afghanistan. Not to comment too much on the question about the Swiss defense model, but it is an interesting one, and I'm saying that really now as an analyst and not as a NATO official, because of its sort of whole of society approach. It is a total defense, total society approach towards security and defense, and I think there's a lot to be learned, as there is, for instance, also from Finland and other countries that have a similar approach. As we look at what I was saying earlier, security threats that try to undermine society, that try to turn institutions against each other, these are models we should engage. Very much agree with the two ideas. I think on youth, there is a need to expose upcoming generations to strategic thinking, to understand why security and defense matters to our democracies and to our institutions, why it's not about just spending on arms, it's about keeping options open for our leaders to make choices as democratically elected leaders. That needs to be recalled again and again with youth, but also with up-and-coming parliamentarians, and that's where this forum would do a good job in doing that. And finally, yes, I agree entirely on the point about the Western Balkans. I think that especially now, we in NATO, as with the upcoming accession, hopefully, of North Macedonia, we are very aware of the need to maintain that kind of amity and concord in the Western Balkans, and maintain good friendly relations amongst the countries in that region, both those who are in and outside NATO.
Thank you. I already have 6 more contributions on my list, so I think I'll take them all and do what the what panelists hate is have to then answer to a barrage of questions. But in the interest of time, we'll work down the list this way and start with Viktor Yengibaryan from Armenia.
Thank you very much. And because it's the last session of our event, I would like to thank the organizers. It's really very helpful for a country like Armenia, and I'm very glad that Mr. Guber is here. We have a very wonderful cooperation with DCAF, and we try to continue our cooperation to enhance our parliament's oversight capacities. My question is regarding the fake news on and hate speech on media space. How NATO, how you are facing this new challenge, and on both on legislative level and also on technical level, and how do you cooperate with your partners regarding this matter?
Thank you. Now the NATO PA President, Madeleine Moon.
Thank you. When I walked in here this morning, the first conversation I had with Damian was about a conversation we had earlier this year. And he said, I am working on the seminar at the university here in Brussels. We will be doing it very soon. So that is something we've been very keen to promote. And as you know, I am very dedicated to engaging with young people. So anybody who wants me to come and talk at their university, I'm up for it. I'm more than happy to take that, and I'm so pleased we're starting it at here, hopefully, in Brussels. One of the problems that we have, as parliamentarians, we come, we focus for 2-3 days, and then we go home, and we can be drowned in the incoming issues. So, your top 2 takeaways of must focus on and implement and work towards achieving when we go home.
Next is Aušrinė Armonaitė from Lithuania.
Thank you. I have a comment regarding the future of Rose-Roth initiative. I totally agree what was said about reaching out the public and students, maybe organizing more public events in universities. But I also think that it's really important to keep in mind that we need to reach out those countries that either pursue NATO membership or are neighboring countries to the NATO countries. I just got to know that probably we will have an open event here in Brussels in some university, but I also think that it's very important to organize our initiatives in these countries that I've mentioned before, having event in Tbilisi, or I don't know, in some universities in some other countries, maybe Ukraine, even maybe Belarus, who knows, in the future. I think it would make a broader impact in building consensus. Because what we have learned from yesterday is that recent NATO enlargements were such a success story because of consensus that was achieved in these countries. So I think we as NATO PA, as members of parliaments, we need to reach out not only our colleagues, decision makers from other countries, but also to the public. And especially in, 21st century, when we are all in social media, even right now, I think we also need to use these tools, and it's even a guilt not to use these tools in reaching out the public. Not only youth, maybe, also other groups in the society. So this is just a short comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Aušrinė. Next is Oksana Yurinets from Ukraine.
Thank you very much.
I have a comment. I will be speak Ukraine. Дуже дякую за проведення цього заходу і насправді можливості на рівні парламентів обговорити і почути один одного у важливих для нас питаннях. Це питаннях безпеки, розширення НАТО, реалізації політики відкритих дверей. Для країн-кандидатів ці заходи реагування на нові виклики є дуже важливими сьогодні. Але я хочу сказати про те, що відбулося вчора в українському парламенті, бо саме там мала активну роботу. Напевно, нема так зле, щоб не вийшло на добре. І ми сьогодні маємо глобально мріяти, але локально швидко діяти. І вчора в парламенті був прийнятий закон про засади функціонування державної мови, в якій поправка, вимогу якою ставила для нас Угорщина, була прийнята саме в цьому новому законі. І я вже тут хочу сказати, що ми довели, що ми тримаємо слово. І так само чекаємо від партнерів у розв'язанні питання блокування Україна-НАТО з боку Угорщини. І сподіваємося, що не буде висунуто інших вимог. Окрім того, вчора в парламенті було прийнятий важливий закон про розмінування, який дає можливість сьогодні ще нового напрямку співпраці з НАТО. Я хочу подякувати за допомогу трастових фондів НАТО в кібербезпеці, бо ми пройшли демократичні вибори, нас чекають осінню наступні демократичні вибори. І це є вкрай важлива співпраця. І ще один важливу постанову, яку вчора було прийнято в українському парламенті, це проведення сесії весною у 2020 році. У нас будуть вибори осінню, але ми розуміємо, що ми діємо на майбутнє. І ми сьогодні чітко обговорюємо не лише сьогодення, але і перспективу. А також я хочу запросити усіх на міжпарламентську раду, яка відбудеться у Львові. Це Західна Україна, і останній захід парламентської асамблеї НАТО там відбувався 10 років тому. Це була Розі-Рота. Саме там ми зможемо із політичним комітетом так само обговорити ряд питань, побачити, як відглядає сучасний центр співпраці миротворення в Яворівському полігоні, де, як сьогодні, вже члени країни НАТО, солдати тренуються з українськими солдатами, центр миротворення, а так само Академію сухопутних військ, так само схожу, як Вестпойнт український, де вчаться 4 спеціальності – це танкісти, артилерісти, піхотинці і сапери. Ми хочемо показати, яким чином сьогодні ми виконуємо швидко домашнє завдання, бо дуже важливо зрозуміти, що в парламенті завдяки обставинам, які складаються, всі зрозуміли, що час швидкоплинний. І багато загроз, які є сьогодні в інформаційному просторі, фейковості, іншим речам, які необхідно протистояти, це можна справитись лише спільно і разом. Тому welcome to Ukraine and welcome to Lviv in June 24-25 day.
Thank you, Oksana. Ivans Klemantjevs from Latvia.
Thank you very much for organizing this 100th seminar, Rose-Roth. I think nobody don't have the questions to be, not to be, to continue. No, of course we need to continue, but yesterday during the dinner we saw very beautiful photo from many different Rose-Roth seminar, and also there was one photo from Bishkek, 2012. I think it was the last seminar what we visit the Middle Asia. But Middle Asia also, it's very interesting region, and also it's I can say like maybe very fragile region also, because very close it's the Afghanistan, what's also they have many problems, and maybe also we need to put in our plan also for the next also visit this region, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan or Kyrgyzstan. How you see this region for the future for cooperation, because always we invite this country to participate in our General Assembly. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And last but not least, Denis Samuts.
Thank you. I think, first of all, we need to reflect a little bit about what were the strengths of the Rose-Roth seminars. And I see the mixture of 3 things together that have made this process quite unique. And this is based on my observation of many of these events that I have been able to attend in the past. It brought together, well,
NATO in some form, and despite the fact that the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is not NATO, but in many countries where the seminars were held, this was perceived as being an event closely connected with the alliance. It was essentially a parliamentary event, so we have in each seminar the majority of participants are members of parliament, and that gives it a lot of weight politically, but it has not been exclusive. It has actually been an inclusive process. So in these seminars, we have seen participants coming from think tanks, civil society, the military, and other sectors of society. And I think it is this mix that has created a very specific dynamic. So my first point is, let's make sure that we don't lose this, because it's one of the strengths. The second point is, how do we go forward with regards to the to what we are discussing? And I would like to see perhaps a little bit more structured, a little bit more planned approach. So instead of saying, well, next year we'll do a seminar here and do a seminar there, to have a more thematic approach, a theme that can be pursued over a number of years, and also a regional approach. This has been mentioned by a number of the speakers already. It is very useful if the Rose-Roth can go into a region and actually galvanize participation from the region around the topics that it is discussing. And finally, a small appeal. I know that we still have on the agenda candidate countries for NATO and etc. But I think these seminars are extremely useful in reaching out to those who are not converted. So we should not simply say, well, there is a lot of interest and a lot of support, and so we go there. We need to go to places where there is less interest and perhaps less support, where there are still questions about what is really the NATO alliance, what James McKee mentioned yesterday about how people are still stuck in a Cold War paradigm in their thinking of NATO. So this is perhaps to be a bit more ambitious looking forward in terms of the audience we are trying to reach. Thank you.
Great. Well, Thomas and Ruben, I feel very sorry for you having to respond to some of the great ideas that we heard. What I would suggest, since we're already running out of time, is maybe pick 2 or 3 questions that you think are most relevant to each of your functions. And then in any case, we're drafting a summary of these discussions, so we will have a comprehensive record of all the suggestions that have been made throughout this discussion. So maybe I'll start with you, Ruben, and then give the final word to Thomas.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll try to do justice to those rich questions and interventions. On the question about hybrid, and particularly fake news and disinformation, I think this is something that we take very seriously. At the same time, we're very much aware that this is something where we don't always have all the tools at NATO. You mentioned, for instance, legislation. That's not something that we can do. That's why it's essential to work both at the international but also at national level in a sort of whole-of-government approach or even whole-of-society approach. And a manifestation of that for us at NATO is the very deep cooperation that we've now established with the European Union. Countering hybrid, countering disinformation is a key priority for us in our cooperation with the European Union. That said, we are taking it seriously also within NATO. It's something that is of increasing interest to our work in the context of intelligence sharing, but also in our public diplomacy and press and media work. We are increasingly investing more and more resources into analyzing the disinformation strategies being used against NATO and its members as well as its partners. We are working very closely also to sort of assist partners in building their awareness of how to strengthen the resilience of their institutions, the reality of tactics being used in the context of disinformation, but also cyber attacks and so forth. So it is something that is very much top of our agenda. but it's something that we cannot do alone. And again, it's something that you, as parliamentarians, as politicians, really have a key role to play in countering some of these tactics. My other comment would be on the question of the top two takeaways. Number one is simple. I think that the value of NATO and the transatlantic alliance and this larger community that the partnerships represent. Keep passing on that message. Keep explaining why it's important to have this community and what it does for the security and safety of all our citizens, and the responsibilities that flow from that in terms of defense spending, in terms of burden sharing. That is something that needs to be explained again and again and again. And the second thing is perhaps more philosophically, keep doing your work as parliamentarians. A vigorous democracy that delivers on what citizens want is the best way to counter those who are arguing at the global level that democracy is a model of the past and delivers only corruption and failure and decadence. That is the best thing you can do. Just be the best politician you can be.
Thank you. Thomas?
Very much. Let me also, first of all, respond to Madeleine's two takeaways. I would, somewhat echo what Ruben has said, but emphasize the fact that we live in in difficult times. There's a lot of power political tension in the air. The fact that the dimension of rule of law, good governance, respect for human rights, cannot be weakened in all of those decisions and trade-offs that you need to make, because not only would it weaken the value base which binds us all together, but there's also very, very strong empirical evidence which would suggest that we would in the long term not contribute to sustainable security and stability if we were to do that. And secondly, when it comes to some of those specific trade-offs, and maybe the trade-off mentioned by the distinguished gentleman from Armenia falls in that category. The management of information, disinformation, manipulation. There is a fair amount of good material already available. How to preserve the integrity of information. Information disclosure policy, treatment policies. So I would link it to an invitation to maybe look what's already available, what has been produced in the context of past Rose-Roth discussions, but also visit the DCAF website where you can see, a wealth of information. And as a footnote, if you come to the conclusion that, crucial elements are missing, I think this group should know it, because, linking this point to what Dennis has said, more structure in the program. I think whatever the Assembly does should, fundamentally be needs-based. So the structure and the program should be based on your needs. So the idea of maybe considering some kind of a review to see whether what the program or the seminar intends to do still corresponds to your needs, I think would not be a bad idea. The intervention by the distinguished gentleman from Latvia, the linkage to Asia, just to say, if that were to be one of your priorities, just to say that DCAF has experience with interparliamentary networks also in Asia, which could be brought to this discussion, if it were to take place in this format. Yes, I think this is...
Let me thank both of you. I think seeing the number of contributions, this panel really has succeeded in steering an interesting discussion about the future of the Rose-Roth program and possible avenues for evolution. And I think just picking up on one of your last points, Thomas, this idea of let's maybe review the needs and then see how we can best address them. That's a good place to start, and that links us then very smoothly into the concluding session where I'm now going to invite Secretary General David Hobbs and President Madeleine Moon to conclude this seminar and maybe precisely discuss the way forward in discussing some of those ideas. Thank you again to both of you. So let us start maybe with Madam President. Did you get the answers you were hoping for from our two panelists about the takeaways and maybe how you see then this discussion continuing within the Assembly on the Rose-Roth in the future?
Well, I'm not going to be as nice as the speakers, because if ever I think there was a real wake-up call in the last 2 days. 100 seminars, but going back to what the PA achieved in using Rose-Roth as a way of helping new states move from a past as members of the Warsaw Pact, embracing NATO, embracing NATO's values, and building new, robust societies. That's pretty stunning, and I think we've pocketed it. We've put it in our pockets, and we've taken it for granted. And we've taken for granted how recent it was, and therefore how vulnerable it can remain. I think all of us have a new task to step up. There's a great deal of unfinished business there across all of our societies. And I really feel that there's almost a doubling down on the responsibilities here at the PA to help us take those messages back into our societies. I had a message from my local newspaper who said, could I stop writing my regular columns about defense and security because it didn't really affect the people of Bridgend? And I went back and said, oh, I'm sorry, I hadn't realized that we had an iron dome over Bridgend that protected us from the threats that were affecting the whole of the Western Alliance. But there is an attitude that defense is something that we can go soft on. We can take a bit of a holiday on it. And I think the last 2 days, if nothing else, will have woken us up to the fact that no, that isn't what we can do. And that the people in the past took that job very seriously. It's time for us to also move that forward. I would have liked more emphasis, actually, in the what are the two new things that we really need to focus on. I think it's our values. There is a danger that in democracies we think that to keep things peaceful, to make things easier, we can just do little compromises on those values that actually are our foundation stones. And we're weakening our foundation stones if we don't keep those values robust and strong. So as parliamentarians, I would say every day in Parliament we have to stand up and say, no, this is not good for us. We will not have this. The other thing I have to commend is, in the short time that I've been president, I've seen two things happen that have deeply impressed me. The one was the major compromise between the Greeks and the North Macedonians. Wow. And the first thing I did was go to Greece and say, thank you. The North Macedonians are feeling kickback right now in their own country. And their election is difficult. And we will wait to see the outcome of that. This morning I woke up and I saw the news of the decision in Ukraine. And hopefully, the difficulties they've had over the language law and their acceptance of the Hungarian amendment will mean that they too will be able to make that huge move forward. So there is a difference between compromising on the issues that create tensions between us and the compromises on the values that we uphold. And we need to do more work on that. My big thanks go, as always, to those who've made the last few days possible. Damian, I think you've been absolutely amazing. Thank you for today and hosting us here. I have to thank all of our speakers. I have to thank the NATO organizers for allowing us to use the deeply uncomfortable room, I have to say, but at least welcoming us to that headquarters, which is where we stand. And there's an element of, I know it's uncomfortable, but actually the significance of us being in that building is more important to a day of discomfort. So I'm going to say, guys, sorry, we'll try and get those of you with the longer legs, perhaps more comfortable seats, nearer the front, but we have to stay going there because it is a huge message. But also to the PA staff, because we roll up for 2 days, but the staff have been working on this for months. And without that work, it doesn't happen. And just finally, thank all of you who take the time during the coffee breaks and the lunch breaks to come and talk to me about what the issues are that you're facing and what we can do to help with that. Because that actually is so important to me. If I don't know, we can't see what we can do about it. So thank you for those conversations. And thank you also for those who said, we'd like to hold a Rose-Roth, because actually that's the success of Rose-Roth. People see it and say, I want to do that in my country. So thank you for those offers to host. And I want to just end with Oksana's quote, which I really loved. We need to be more dynamic. And that's, I think, a great thing to take away from here today. We need to be more dynamic, but we also have to reinforce, not only to our young people, but also to our colleagues, there can be no compromising on our values.
Thank you, Madam President. David, would you like to share your takeaways from these 2 days?
It'll only take an hour. No, it's impossible to give you a good summary of all the takeaways, although Madeline's been magnificent. I've been cheerfully deleting many of the things I was going to say. Just let me raise a few issues, and firstly is to concur, as I always do, but in this case totally sincerely, with my president, because we should define NATO as what it is for. As I said at the beginning, we always say, when somebody says to you, what's NATO for? That's exactly the right question. It's not what NATO's against, it's what NATO's for. And the values thing, it's the guiding principles. If you think what NATO stands for, you won't go far wrong. Even so, there are massive areas of policy which are frankly hard. And you know, I won't go into all of them, but we had a terrific panel this morning on Russia. Russia is kind of obviously in the background and in the foreground for many things. And you know, there's a whole spectrum here. There's, at one end, there's recognition of legitimate interests. At what point does that turn into appeasement? We'll never agree. You put all those people in a different in a room, it's a spectrum. But we have to have some form of working relationship or understanding. There has to be, and we have to have a policy.
That's going to just be there forever. So many ideas about Rose-Roth, just as a purely sort of administrative thing. If anything were easy, we'd have done it. First point, one of the things that's emerged from this, what a magnificent program this has been, and I can't praise our predecessors highly enough, and Simon's right there. He's been very much the architect of this program, and one of the things I would certainly be doing afterwards is getting his takeaways from this, because we must not forget the legacy of the past when we're talking about how we move forward. We have to adapt or die. There's no doubt about that. What did work in the past, let's maintain those principles, but you can't just continue doing the same thing, because we'd like to get to 200, and it won't be doing the same things that we did for the first 100. One thing which emerges, the Assembly has unique features and selling points. What came out, flexibility, adaptability, and the ability to bring the parliamentary, the civil society dimensions to NATO's partnerships in a way that reinforces, enriches, and enhances them. And perhaps what we ought to be doing as we think how to structure that is perhaps engage NATO a little bit more in our thinking as we're talking about the way ahead. And again, move more thematically in some areas, because as NATO itself is doing, and we've tried to do this already, NATO is now trying to take some of the partnership tools that work so well with some of the people who are now members and apply those partnership tools in different regions, such as the Middle East, North Africa. And perhaps there are lessons that we can take and say, okay, let's talk to some of the previous victims. What are the lessons that you learned? And that's not regional. That's kind of partner specific. I just say one thing that we've done. We had a seminar in Helsinki some time ago, and maybe it was premature. We should look at these things. We looked at Baltic and Nordic models of cooperation and said, well, how would that apply to places like the Balkans and the South Caucasus? And I think those are sorts of things that we can look at. It's not, I totally agree with Dennis's thoughts as well. Obviously, it's wonderful, as much structure and forward planning as you can do. But of course, we have to have hosts. And if you don't have willing hosts, then you can't really go there. And so preaching to the non-converted is obviously a good idea, but if the non-converted aren't going to welcome you, you can't impose a seminar upon them. Other than that, then obviously Dennis gets it all right. I'm not going to go any further. We've got tremendous food for thought. We need to try and absorb all this and write it up. Let me conclude with a few thanks. Damian, I'm going to thank properly. Again, fabulous. It emerged as a meeting when Madeleine visited the Parliament. You've been tremendously welcoming. It's an absolute pleasure to be here so close to to our seat. But Damian, thank you so much indeed. And I cannot forget Luke Pettermans and Sonia Langenbach, because there we go. Without their fabulous assistance and consistent support, by the way, not just here but throughout, as the host country, we'd be lost without you. Big thank you. I'm going to stop there. Our Belgian hosts. I thank several of my colleagues last night, Andreas and Roberta, as the people who've been most thoroughly engaged in this particular seminar, but it was all hands to the pumps, because it was hosted by the International Secretariat, sort of organised by, and so many of my other colleagues have chipped in. I'm not going to name all of them, but I must mention Sarah Foulon, Valerie Geoffroy, and I'll stop there, but all my colleagues from the International Secretariat, thanks for chipping in. And thanks to all of you for coming. And from my experience as a long-term resident of this country and a previous visit of this Parliament, one of the great privileges, a Belgian lunch. Thank you very much. Damian, the floor.
Thank you, David. As the President said, we have to be more dynamic. I will give you an opportunity to be a little bit more dynamic because the lunch we have this noon is on the other side of the street, out of this building. So we have to go a little bit outside, and it's 2 minutes working, but if we have a dynamic working, we start with the will of the wish of our president. Enjoy your meal. Thank you.